This video is less about Omori than about what Omori is about. It deals with grief and trying to overcome that grief. It deals with loneliness and anxiety and the separation that follows. It deals with friendship and maintaining relationships with others in spite of the fact that emotions can be very complicated. Actually having friends, actually dealing with people is complicated. This is a game that deals with imagination, some of the beauty that can come from imagination, some of the ways that imagination can be an escape, and yet can also be a deadening off of opportunity. Imagination can be such a luxury and sweet release that you can't motivate yourself to actually go out towards something that isn't owned by you. One of the worst problems of imagination is it's all yours, and one of the biggest challenges of the world is it's not yours at all. And having to deal with other people's minds, other people's choices, the remnants of society that you had nothing to do with, having to deal with all of those aspects of day-to-day life is so much scarier than the control seemingly that you have over your own mind. But then this game also deals with the ways in which we can lose ourselves in our own mind. We can lose track of what's best for ourselves in service of feeling comforted moment to moment. This video is a kind of close reading of an experience. Something like a live reaction to a game, except a step or two more thoughtful. There's a kind of value in just talking about what you noticed in something, because these games or any books that you read or any films or even a theater performance that you watch, we're all attending to different details. Different things stand out to us because we are relating to it with our own personalities intact. My brother and I actually went on two different paths in this game. I went through what's called the hikikomori path, which is the isolated path. I refused to exit my little dream space. There is an option very early in the game where you get a knock on the door and you can open it and you can let a friend in. You can talk to them and then you can go out into the real world, or you can stay isolated, and I chose to stay isolated. My brother didn't do that. My brother actually opened the door. He got access to that whole separate space. So this video, you're going to hear two people both talking about the main ideas in the game, but also surprising each other by revealing the differences of experience. Because that one little choice, like so many choices in life, branches out to a wide array of other differences. And in this case, I get to hear about all of the real world stuff that I missed, and then I get to explain some of the deeper wells of dreaming that are available in this game. And then you get to hear my brother react to it. When you and I first played this game, I think the most shocking thing about it was that opening scene where you have the black line going down, 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 and then there's this little light bulb in the center of a white room and you have that kid just staring up at it. And it's immediately just empty and vague, stark and lonely and kind of despairing. Especially because the game doesn't really tell you how to leave that space immediately. You're sort of stuck staring at the same objects again and again and trying to figure your way out. That to me was such a great emotional introduction to what this game is going to be about. This game immediately was just, okay, we're going to be about repetition. So much of loneliness, if you're truly lonely and you isolate yourself, it does become a very intimate relationship with repetition. You just get so used to the objects that you know and the familiar things that you use that becomes the entirety of your world, and anything unfamiliar becomes all the more scary precisely because of its unfamiliarity. Then you in this little white space, you get to look at this laptop and see that the character's been there day after day after day doing the exact same thing. And you know that, okay, this is a game about being locked in. And then when you actually escape from that locked in space, it suddenly becomes surreal nonsense. In this weird psychedelic wonderland, and everything is exuberant and bright, and it's just totally contrasted to that flat space. You and I, having played through the game now, we've gone to all these different places, and the memory of the game all in all is quite colorful, but because it opened with this really stark black and white, dark psychological space, all of that kind of joy and happiness and variety and seemingly up emotional states seems all wavering around the precipice of knowing that you're going to go back to that again and again. There's this overarching design like, look, we're going to put every kind of colorful thing that we can at you. It's very clear that you're in the mind of a child, but it's also very clear that all of this is going to be bookended by something very stark and unavoidable, and that is this private space of death. The grief was ongoing through the whole thing. The way that sometimes if you're in a sad state of mind, it doesn't even matter how good things are objectively in terms of how many friends surround you, how many adventures you could go on. The fact of knowing that you're going to go back to that hollowness makes it all numb to a certain extent. And so this main character never changes color while everything else is bright and glowy. He's still that little black and white figure. He knows where he's going. At the end of this trip, he's going to go back into the white space.
To varying extents, everybody is going to be fed more and more information about at least what's going on in Omori's head. And as they do that, they'll realize an awareness of the isolation at the center of it. He's going into this dream world to escape the reality of the fact that not only is he afraid of the outside world, but he's afraid of what that fear has created for him. He's afraid of the fact that he's not going to continue telling a story in his life. He's not going to continue forming new memories. It's not going to be something that he can reminisce about in the future. So what can he reminisce about? He can reminisce about pleasant imagery that he comes up with, based probably on media that he's consumed. All he has is the things that have comforted him in his life. And that comfort becomes the basis for his entire escape from the consequences of not facing the outside world. It is that classic prison of your own design, because he knows that he's only in this white space that contains no flavor, no ups and downs, no life, because he's turned his back on life. And now that he's in that situation, he actually has even more reason, unfortunately, in a spiraling way. He has even more reason to keep going into his mind, because he knows that if he doesn't have a fake world to return to, then he has no world at all. So he has to create a bigger and bigger dream world just to occupy himself, just to give himself a sense of identity and a sense of meaning. It's really ironic and tragic. He incentivizes himself to go deeper into that dream.
It is a kind of Alice in Wonderland tale. But it is interesting to think about what kind of story Alice in Wonderland is, and also the ways in which Omori deviates from that kind of story. Alice in Wonderland fits into literary nonsense, sometimes called nonsense literature, and the object of that genre is merely to follow a kind of lunatic logic to its end. That surrealist, free associative, taking your subconscious seriously, allowing the subconscious to divide out, and letting the symbolism that emerges from that be not overly guided by the author. The writer of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, he plays with nonsense literature in a variety of other ways. He has this poem Jabberwocky, where you get the Vorpal blade and the Bandersnatch and all these words, where he's mixing things together. The idea is that the association of ideas, the free association of ideas, the playing with a different order of reasoning, is itself as worthy of consideration as logic itself would be. The logical story is just you follow the character, they have wants, and there's a conflict block in their wants, and it's all very clearly, you can follow every single step. It's all the but and therefore of the logic, right? Alice in Wonderland and stories like Omori, what they're toying with is, what are the things that we fixate on? What are the things that hold our attention? What is the mind really like when it's not being controlled by us? When we're not just directing it to some end? One of the things that I really like about Omori is the constant element of portmanteau throughout the whole thing. The literary device where you combine words together. It's usually done in poetry, and Lewis Carroll does this in the Jabberwocky poem, and James Joyce is famous for this in his book Finnegan's Wake, where he takes words and he just smashes them together. It's the associations of those words, and especially when the words are different from each other, it makes you pause and actually process what it is that you just read a little bit longer than you otherwise would. It's that confusion of meaning that adds to the meaning. Confusion is actually a literary device in and of itself. In Omori, you're wandering around and there's this portmanteau thing happening where so many of the characters you're seeing and so many of the enemies are just amalgamations or slammed together concepts, just like slamming together words. The usefulness of that is there is an overabundance of meaning now. When you slam the words together or you slam the images together, it now creates more meaning that you know what to do with. And so then you get to forcibly put yourself onto that meaning. You are then a part of the process. It's not quite so dictated as a generic story would be. If you follow a regular story that follows a logic, then you're gonna get this is the good person, this is the bad person, this is the feeling you're supposed to have right now, and that's it. And of course Omori has that. It has a structure, it has a story, it has a plot. But it also is using that nonsense literature element. It's good to play with that part of the mind, because the thing that is different from Alice in Wonderland and Omori is there's also a great deal of psychological horror in the middle of this. The mind itself is not only a grab bag of ideas, it's also a source of torture. The significance of psychological horror is unlike the horror of a ghost story or a zombie tale or a vampire story. Instead of this thing that's scary being something outside of you that you can kill, the thing that is scariest is you. And that's terrible because to kill it would be to end yourself. It becomes something truly inescapable. And so when you're playing through Omori and all of these weird amalgamations are happening and all of this humor kind of thrown over top, the unceasing psychological horror that permeates through the whole thing becomes the only theme that matters. It becomes the theme that is the outline for all of the other things that you're seeing, all the other shadows that you're glimpsing. It is the flame that's sort of shooting them back onto the back wall. There's a consistency in tone throughout this game. A lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a personal creation. It's created by this artist named Omori. She started a Kickstarter like over 6 years ago, got funding for it, started to build up a whole team. It was this vision that she had. It's that personal element that then leads to just a pure consistency. And that consistency is the psychological horror of being alone, of being hikikomori, being that kind of person, and what that entails, what that means.
The game has an impressive degree of scope and scale in spite of the fact that it is so surreal. You would think that when you're making something that is based on a kind of nonsense, that you would eventually run out of momentum there, that you would lose steam when you're trying to keep adding track in front of you as the train reaches further and further into your imagination, and you have to keep imagining the consequences of something that you also imagined. It is a strength that some people develop when they are used to isolating themselves for a long time. It is kind of the upswing of being isolated for some people, is that they do become very imaginative. There's this word, paracosm, the word for what often children create when they are trying to process their problems as a child. They create something called a paracosm, which this game is basically about. It's just another world. It's another world that they create, and they keep adding to it as much as they can. And it becomes an extremely rich environment because it only exists to fulfill the aim of being a large space that is full of distraction. This game really manifests that on the scale that it needs to feel real. Like, it feels like an actual paracosm. It's not just a running joke. It's not just all one theme. The themes change, the colors change, the environments are vastly different from each other, and all really incredibly detailed when you look closely. There's so much unnecessary creativity just bursting out of the seams of this world.
That overabundance of imaginative quality also feeds into the constant slow trickle of information. One thing that's distinct about this experience is how little you and I actually know about what is causing so much of this pain. Usually when a character is dealing with something intensely, it's abundantly clear to the viewer so that they can relate to it. They can connect their own story to that story. This game, there's a huge absence in the story that we're not fully aware of. We're not fully cognizant of what that absence is, and it just becomes a trigger that shot off long before we showed up, and we're seeing the cascading remnants of it. We're like the detective who shows up at the murder scene, and they have to sort of work their way back and figure out, okay, well, why are all of these weird pieces together? Why is this kid, why does he have these friends that he has? Why does he have Kel and Aubrey and Mori and Hiro? And why is Hiro this kind of perfect, distant figure? Why is he like the least complex of all? This guy who seems almost too perfect for his own good. Why do Kel and Aubrey keep fighting? And why does Mori stay at a picnic basket the whole time? Why is Mori this weird safe haven? She's the only permanence in this weirdly fluctuating imaginary space. And you go back to her again and again to both heal yourself psychically and physically. You eat food and it refills your psychic ability to do magic, and it refills your health, and you save there. It's literally a permanence. And she is this one locked in thing that is incapable of change in this space. It's like this character wants all of the brimming abundance of deviation and change of what it would be like to live an adventurous life, so long as she gets to be safe and the same. And then you just kind of have to ponder about that, about like, well, what is the suffering here? Why did it come together? It's not purely random. The nonsense literature of it is not just throwing words at a wall and then seeing what sticks. All of this is hints at something much bigger. One important element of experiencing this game for the first time, when the information is slowly trickling out and you're learning more and more about what's really happening and what's going on, The one thing that you do seem to know is that there is a world that is in past tense for this character. You get glimpses of going in and out between the real world version, which is himself as Sunny, and this dream version, which is himself as Omori. The dream version is a constructor set made up of parts of real world experiences mashed together into new forms. So much of what's in this world is this potential 80s environment of media consumption, right? Even very early in the game, when you're wandering through like the junkyard, you see all of these cassette tapes and telephone lines and Ethernet cords attached. It was all of these old technological devices, but it was also the kinds of things that you would find if you were inside. If your version of the world is so much of whatever you're consuming in some kind of media. His awareness of the world does not include, or at least what he seems to present, does not include some of the more nuanced, complicated parts of actually living in the world. That stuff doesn't seem mixed into this odd dream world. It's much more like caricature versions of things. The thought that I was having when I was first playing the game, before we got much further, is it really matters that this is the emotions that some young kid is going through. Like someone stunted in youth and just trapped there. And the thing that's really significant about being young and dealing with emotions is when you're young, you lack so much historical evidence of your own resilience. When something's really difficult, you truly don't know if you can handle it. And that creates a very immediate terror at the possibility of utter failure. And I do think that sense of utter failure is a kind of sense of death. Like, I could die from this. And of course that's an exaggeration. As you grow up, you realize that most things won't kill you. The vast majority of what scares you is often only scary in imagination. But when you're young, you don't know that yet. And so much of experience is exaggerated. Playing through this game feels like someone who didn't go out and actually get the lesson that they are stronger than they think they are, that they actually can handle these things. It's significant that you're following a kid being lonely because a kid is someone who takes emotions as paramount and serious and doesn't have the tools yet of knowing how to deal with it. There's this concept of attachment theory, and it's this idea that young children are constantly assessing the ambient safety level of their environment. And much of that ambient safety comes from relationships, and it's the reliability of those relationships. So if you have a mother who you can predictably say she's going to react this way and this way and this way, that means that all of that is stable, which then allows more degrees of exploration beyond that. But if you have someone in your life who you could do the exact same thing and you're not sure if they're going to blow up angry or if they're going to make it about them or if they're going to care for you, and you're constantly craving the times that they care, then the only exploration you take is in relation to that person, is not in relation to other things outside of that relationship with that person. And that applies to also the safety you feel in your environment. If you feel like you're in a constant state of risk everywhere you go, well then exploration is death. Exploration becomes a horror that you need to avoid. Whereas if you're in a setting where you feel that safety is guaranteed, well then exploration is joy, and exploration is discovery, and it's positive. If you have someone who becomes locked in, there's so much implied about what view of ambient safety they have about their life. If someone gets trapped into the familiarity of sameness and difference is scary or difference is uncomfortable, that implies some tail end point early on where they rationally had an understanding that there wasn't the safety in place to explore. The tragedy of this game seems to circle around that kind of locking in. In the title, it makes it very clear that this is a hikikomori character, someone who is acutely socially adverse, is pushing away from society and the rest of the world in order to feel comfort. It's important to understand why someone would do that. It's really easy to look down on someone for being scared. I think that's the temptation. If someone is skittish, anxious in any way, especially if they're anxious about something that you experience regularly or that you've overcome yourself, it can be almost like this weird rite of passage ingrained that you feel like you have to then kick them out of it. They just need to do what I did and they'll be fine. But because they didn't do what you did, they're already in a different state than you. The reason for them to be that way is so much a part of their character at this point that it wouldn't follow to then think that you can just have them do the exact same thing that you did. They're already in a different headspace. And this kid is clearly in this fantasy space to try to escape from all this somehow.
I think it's great to have a piece of art that talks about the mundane kind of bravery that comes into something like socializing, like facing people and building relationships and not isolating yourself. It does require a kind of bravery. Not a dramatic kind, because it isn't a mortal danger. And normally I would associate bravery with being genuinely at risk of dying and facing that fear anyway. But this is more of a mundane feeling of security, right? There's insecurity versus security. This ability that we sometimes have to realize that we're going to experience something unpleasant and just understand that that's part of the process. We all have some things in our lives that we are comfortable with facing head on in spite of difficulty. And then we have other things in our lives, especially as children, that for whatever reason we assume are going to injure us permanently if we come at them at the wrong angle. And that's where insecurity, I think, comes from. It's this idea that, like, I'm not going to be able to handle this failure. So even though everything in life can lead to failure, this is the kind of failure that I must avoid. It's a kind of pain that is going to actually harm me. When it comes to the things that we are skilled at, when it comes to the things that we just do without even thinking because we've always done them, those things are not without their risk. The risk is always just acknowledged and faced. That's really the only difference that we end up encountering when we find ourselves being brave or having a sense of security in ourselves. It's just the realization that facing a challenge is not going to end the game, that we don't need to make sure that we never face these challenges. The failure is just a step on the way to our goal. I think what's surprising, certainly surprising for me, that I still find myself capable of feeling insecure even though I know what security feels like. There's something kind of complicated and hard to replicate about security. We do it so naturally in certain circumstances. Before, I used to be tentative about a really hard game. Like, I used to not want to. I used to dread going up against a hard boss because I thought, what if I'm playing this boss forever? What if I never actually beat it? Or in life, I used to be really terrified of public speaking. And now I can make these videos with my brother without worrying that I'm going to embarrass myself. Because even if I do embarrass myself, I just have this sense that that's going to be okay. You never get to a point where you're so skilled at something that you think you can't fail. You just think you can recover from failure.
The tough thing about living is we don't have access to facts. We only have access to beliefs. And so when you believe that something is insurmountable, it becomes as insurmountable as something that actually factually is insurmountable. Your beliefs become so much the railing that holds you down in whatever path you're on. And you could not realize that the railing is itself a figment, that that thing that you locked into isn't actually there. It goes back to the experience of this game. This is a fantasy world. Because the game gives us a taste of the outside world and the real world, we know with some certainty that this isn't real. That everything we're going through is arbitrary in the sense of self-imposed. So this Omori character is making himself fight again and again. He's making himself get locked in dungeons, be trapped by various characters who try to kill him and his friends. He makes himself go into emotional states of sadness and anger and ecstatic joy, all this mixture. He's making himself go through all of these things. One of the nice things about the metaphor of playing through the game is you are actually doing these things, right? All the things that are made up are performatively done. You are overcoming challenges, and they are actual real challenges in the sense of what a challenge is, some kind of barrier to a goal. In the same way that if you imagine a bunch of problems, by merely believing them, even if they're not real, they are real problems now. It's the horrible conundrum of emotions. There's that quote from Shakespeare, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." It's very simple. And it's this simple idea of we don't relate to the real world without ourselves. We are always there. The story that occurs around that thing becomes the pain. We know that this Omori character is suffering over some loss. And throughout the whole game, we don't know what that loss is, but we know that something is lost for this character. Often when you lose something you really, really care about, it's the separation from that thing that creates so much of the pain. It's like if you and I lost our parents, the fact of us not being able to talk to them again is suddenly immensely painful. It becomes so much of the story we tell ourselves about that pain is I can't talk to them again. I can't see them. I can't give them a hug again. But you and I aren't talking to them right now. And we're not hugging them right now. And we're fine. When you think about how much of the pain is self-imposed, how much am I doing this to myself? Every month I have this little period of time where I get really sad. that has nothing to do with anything. I just wake up and okay, today is that day. And it feels the same every single time. It's like I literally get up and I just have this weird, melancholy, drab, unmotivated malaise, and it feels as if I have nothing in the charge. Just the battery's dead. What if I really thought about that? Really thought how much of this day is just me internalizing something that's a story? How much am I just making a story about this day? I still have that day regularly, but the fact that it's predictable and the fact that I know it's going to be there, the fact that I am going to have this kind of sad moment makes it so that now it becomes like a kind of experiment of myself. I kind of view it as this weird opportunity. Every single month when I feel it, I just sort of think, what is the version of me on this day? What do I do on this day that's different than I couldn't do on the other days? Those days tend to be the ones where I try to just write more. I feel as if the writing's better. I feel as if the thinking is deeper. I feel as if there's something I'm getting in touch with a part of myself that is a better version of myself. It's the exact opposite of what I initially thought of it as. I initially thought of it as this drained state, and now it's become this 3 a.m. all day long vibe. Grief is this weird thing. We all are going to deal with grief, and we're going to tell some story about it, about how much we would like to do X, Y, and Z, and yet we're not doing those things and we're fine, and we weren't doing those things most of the time. We're actually pretty happy by ourselves most of the time. We changed the story, and now we're sad about it.
In complete stark contrast to the real world, Omori's dream world is one in which he is the hero. All of his friends are on his side and they have everything that Omori doesn't have. One of the abilities that you have that is central to the gameplay is your ability to just control emotions, to on command make people happy, sad, angry, and do that to oneself. A lot of the dream world ends up being a photo negative of the real world, and I think that is one of the ways in which the dream world reverses the logic that Omori is used to out there. He's used to not being able to control his emotions, to feeling completely controlled by them, like he has no power over them. And his one central ability that he uses to best his enemies here is that he can make anybody feel however he wants them to feel. And so all of the distress of the people that you encounter along your way, the people who you are trying to solve quests for and provide aid to, are all just people who have the perfectly normal struggle with not knowing how to get out of an emotional problem, not knowing how to address, for example, not being able to get over your breakup with your girlfriend that you thought you were going to be with forever, like Space Ex-Boyfriend. His entire character revolves around him not being able to get over this. His ex-girlfriend's sweetheart is all about being narcissistic and having to make her entire world revolve around supporting her ego. Everybody's problems that the heroes then fix in some way all revolve around being just like Omori knows he is in real life. He knows that he has this fundamental, perfectly universal weakness. He would rather imagine that he's the one person who doesn't have that problem so that he can just fix it for everybody else.
There is a point in the very beginning of the first chapter where all you can hear is a knock repeating again and again. This point is a major split in the game, and at the time that I experienced it, I had no idea its significance. I chose not to open the door for the person who was knocking. And little did I know this actually became the complete split between our two journeys. You opened the door and I didn't. It is a major turning point in the story.
The story has kind of diverged on this point where you decide to either open or close this door, and that basically open or closes the door to an entirely different version of the story. That seems really smart to me, based on the themes that I've noticed so far, because this game so much is about this child who has to create this alternate world in their head that is based on what they think they understand about the world. So much of it is based on fear, as many of us had to deal with when we were growing up, when we didn't understand things. We were afraid of things, and it's often in childhood that people will get started on a path that they might have to grow out of later in life. They will have certain emotional limitations begun at a very young age. It sort of creates a convention where when someone is afraid of something, like for example, they're afraid that when they open the door, something scary will be on the other side, and they feel that they've noticed that that genuinely occurred in the past, whether it's in a nightmare or reality. They feel like it is justified, at least in some moment, to avoid a situation. And that avoidance can sometimes become a convention that remains unbroken even in situations where it's not appropriate. By the game sort of funneling you into a certain path, it sort of simulates that way that emotional experiences and the way that we react to them can lead to a convention that changes the course of our life. Right away, I just think that's really smart.
That seems to be a motif that repeats throughout this game. The way that the characters start to cement themselves based on past behavior into a kind of locked mode. Even though being closed off has led to a kind of deep ongoing misery and separation from the world, it is so much more safe in comparison to having to actually risk closeness. There's this character that we talked about in the prologue, Boss, who had that same kind of thing where his mode of being was to be bossy and rude, and even though it led to all of this self-destructive reaction, all of this anger from all of those he was being bossy to, because it had worked up until that point, that became his locked mode. At one point we meet Sweetheart, and she's someone who's sort of locked into her own decadence, and that becomes a kind of shield. And so we just have back-to-back these characters who, due to their inability to adapt, have worsened their situation in such a way that they haven't noticed how much they've begun digging their own pain into a deeper space. And it becomes all the more painful even though they think that that pain is coming from outside. So much of this game is about that kind of like, well, where does that resilience come from then, if a character is already locked in? The game puts you in that choice. Open the door or don't. I didn't make that choice because I understood the tropes of these games, right? If you see clear evidence that there's a monster on the other side of the door, if the camera is slowly panning and making as obvious as possible, oh, this choice is a significant one, my assumption is, oh, this is how your character dies, so I'm not going to open the door. And of course, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm falling back on what I think I know, and I'm using that as a crutch to not have to make an actual risky decision that potentially pays off.
The first thing I saw when I opened that door was a slow pan up a child's torso, as if to imply that, maybe their head is going to be something scary. It still seemed like Sunny had this expectation. But as it pans up, you see Kel's face, and it has the full color palette. It's not just a blue drawing. This is the real world, and he's smiling at you. The first thing he tells you is he's surprised to see that you opened the door, and he didn't actually have any plans for today because he expected you not to open. He has to think on his feet and come up with a way that you can have fun around town. That's how this chapter begins, with just this unusual situation where you've actually opened yourself up to the world, and now you're going to try to explore and go to your favorite shops and meet some of your other friends. You go to this park nearby, and a lot of the kids play around there, mostly unfamiliar kids who just happen to be of your age. And you find out that Basil, who is one of your friends that you meet in the dream world, the one who lives in the giant shoe and who is known for taking photographs, he is being bullied by another one of your friends, Aubrey. She has stolen his scrapbook of photos. Your first interaction with her is to run up alongside Kel and get in a fight with her. It's an actual fight sequence. It has the combat motif. And then Omori brings out a steak knife and he swipes at her. This scares everybody. This is a weapon that makes more sense in dreams. She immediately flees and says, "You'll pay for this." Everything kind of calms down when Kel takes the knife away from you. This is how you learn that the real world is very different from the dream world. The dream world is a lot simpler, at least in terms of relationships. The relationships are much more complicated in the real city. Aubrey seems to have distanced herself from you in some way. She's become resentful. She seems like she has a rebellious streak now. And Basil is still he hasn't adapted to this, so he's kind of he wishes that things would go back to the way they were, but they clearly aren't.
Hearing this for the first time, actually hearing what's out there in the city, it's intriguing to me that there's so much mirror imaging taking place between the imagined version where there is a playground that you run through and there's all these kids there and he has his friends, right, Aubrey and Kel and all them and Basil. In the real world, those people also exist, so we know that these are projections of these characters in his mind. The fact that this character, Sunny, who's like the real world version of Omori, the fact that this character, Sunny, takes what he imagined as a solution to a problem, which is this knife. In the imaginary world, he's using this knife to overcome all of these enemies and various fears and actually make progress deeper and deeper into his psyche. That becomes a kind of security for him of how you overcome these challenges. And then he tries to adopt that into the real world. And of course, reality doesn't match all of the machinations that we can come up with in our minds. Sunny reminds me so much of those who are locked in the mind, non-stop watching television and films and all these things, these kinds of entertainment that create whole worlds in our mind that feel more real than the world because they are more articulated. They are more clear. Every part connects in a way that's understandable. You want the real world to fit as nicely too. Let's say you imagine how conversations are supposed to go. And you have this imagined back and forth between you and someone else, and then you actually talk to them, and then suddenly they don't want to pause after every comma like they would in your mind. They don't want to just communicate purely through words. They also use expression and intonation in their voice. And all these things that you don't account for suddenly become this huge derailment from your expectations. This Sunny kid is out in this city, in this world, and he's trying to force the world to fit his fantasy, and it just doesn't. I think it's a great element in the story that he actually tries to cut someone, and he doesn't quite understand how bad that is. That's also really sad. It's someone who's just spent too much time locked in. Self-imposed, having been locked in.
This is one of the first things that Sunny experiences when he goes outside for the first time in a great while. Already, he's starting to calibrate to reality. He's starting to actually see, oh, there is a difference, and these are the specific differences that I can recognize. Now I've learned that not everything exists the way it does in my head. So quickly has his isolation been corrected by one notch. He's starting to experience that process of development. This game is already providing just so much insight into what it's like to grow up, developing a greater sense of the real world. It comes across as these scary situations, and these situations where he's at odds with people, but it also is a sign of good things to come in a way, because by learning these lessons early on, he doesn't have to be so locked in when he's older, and he hasn't learned those lessons yet. Already it's become a very different path than probably what you'll see.
It's very few games that are willing to work so hard on an entire section of its world and to know ahead of time that a good proportion of the audience is not going to witness any of it. My experience is strictly in the fantasy world. That's all I know. In fact, my understanding of this game, my memory of this game, is that colorful, weird forest with all these strange, mashed together creatures. That's my view of what Omori is. Your sense of Omori is the city and that fantasy world, going back and forth between those two spaces. That is already a very different kind of experience. Explicitly splitting the storyline. It's capturing what a lot of games do without making it as explicit. Role-playing games, yes, we all share that story, and then we get to discuss the differences in that story. But a lot of games, like if you play something like a Battlefield or a Call of Duty, or if you play Minecraft, your experience of Minecraft is actually fundamentally different than mine. Now you might say, well, no, that can't be the case because we're all using the same tools and we're in the same kind of biomes. And yes, there's some random variation in the blocks, but of course it's the same game, it's the same goals, it's the same series of tools to get through to those goals. But by that reasoning, then we're all living the same life. Most of us have the same tools in our bodies and we have many of the same inclinations and habits. But of course our lives are very different, even with all those similarities. There's this concept of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. It's this idea that you can have the same starting point or the same basic structure at the beginning, but little minor deviations can cascade out into huge variations that are unpredictable. That is so much of the gameplay experience when we're playing a game. We have all of these starting points and we know basically what the game design is going to be, but then because we're bringing ourselves into it and all of those cascades of choices, every gameplay experience is a little bit different. So much of what matters in a gameplay experience is a kind of personal connection and a cascade of choices that branch out from that. This game Omori is doing that process of branching and just making it very clear one's lifetime is not the same. One's gameplay experience is not the same. One's relationship to character and interpretation and meaning is not the same. And that is so much thematically in line with everything that's happening in this game. You're having these characters who are suffering in their own distinct ways and then lashing out that suffering out onto the rest of the world. Your emotions come into play when you're battling. How you're dealing with those differences in reaction to the world becomes your strength and your weakness in tandem. And it's about you sort of mixing that and working your way through it. And that is what we're doing all the time. When we play games, when we live life, when we do anything. All this cascade of dependent systems off of similar starting points. And then just trying to deal with what that is. The split that's happening, it's a confident game design. The exact kind of design that's making you talk about it. In multiple videos now, we've talked about some games are inclined toward communication. Elden Ring is like that. Outer Wilds is like that. Conversation is the extension of the game, and it's precisely because of that deviation and experience of the game, where the game really isn't just one thing for anyone, that fosters that kind of outpouring of conversation and growth.
After Basil informs Sunny and Kel that Aubrey has stolen the scrapbook belonging to Basil, this is when you have the opportunity to explore the town in general, do little side quests for people, which are actually fairly elaborate. There's really a lot going on in the town on the side that is completely optional, but their main mission is to find out where Aubrey went in the hopes that they could return Basil's scrapbook to him and set things right again. They get into some more fights and they find out that Aubrey is actually hanging out at the local church for some reason, not a place that they expect her to be. They sit in a pew behind her and they have a little conversation with her in which they're kind of just trying to get to the bottom of why she's acting this way and figure out if they can be friends again. She's explaining simply that it's just more complicated than they understand. That this simple life that they want to restore is not necessarily something you can restore. That it would really be impossible for things to go back to the way they were. One of the big deviations that made everyone distance themselves from each other was when Sunny's older sister, Mari, died. So now we know that Mari's dead. We don't know yet why she's dead. Something about the nature of Mari dying has led to every child in their own way kind of withdrawing a little more into isolation. Without knowing exactly how she died, we at least get an idea of like, okay, Mari is Sunny's older sister. We know that this has probably had a profound effect on him, and it kind of explains why he has been so depressed in a way that the other kids aren't necessarily. They're all having their own complicated reaction, but Sunny is kind of just isolated now. At the end of that conversation, they do almost sort things out as far as the scrapbook is concerned. Aubrey decides that she doesn't want to keep it anymore. Kel and Sunny witness her throwing it in the trash, and then they fish it out of the trash and they return it to Basil. This is the last scene of the real world section. They go to Basil's house to eat dinner. Before dinner, they're just looking through the scrapbook at their early days when Basil was documenting everything with his camera. It's a fairly filled out scrapbook. There are a lot of pictures explaining that Hiro and Mari are the oldest. Hiro was dating Mari. That might be how the crew even came together in the first place. That was the connection. Hiro now has gone off to college. After they look through all those memories, they sit down for dinner and casually reveal that Sunny is going to be moving somewhere else in 3 days. Basil, when he finds this out, starts to kind of panic and he asks to be excused from the table, runs off into the hallway. You can follow behind him, meet him in the bathroom, and you'll see that this aura of charcoal blackness, of darkness and horror is now surrounding that bathroom. And Basil starts saying some cryptic things. He's saying like, everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be okay. And he looks at Sunny and he says, you can see it too, right? Something behind you. And why do you look so scared? There seems to be an equivalence now between this sense of depression and panic and emotional overwhelm and the horror that is haunting these kids.
It's really unexpected to me how much is revealed by that city section. It almost feels like a complete upending of the structure of the game. My experience through the game, having been solely in the fantasy world with brief respites in the real world but only in the darkness of the home, my experience of the game has been one of a mystery in the backdrop of everything that you're doing, and that mystery is what is the source of this sadness. It sounds like in the city you find out a major source, which is Mari's death. Hearing you explain what happened to Mari is equivalent to a revelation at the end of the game now being told to me in the middle of my experience. It explains so much why Mari isn't wandering through the world with them. So she's this protective, loving figure who's also at a great distance from all the rest of the characters. Brothers and sisters, if it's an older sister, I have an older sister, you can be close to them, but there's so much that you can't understand about them because the age gap and just the difference in lifestyle can make a series of vocalized connections that don't amount to the intimacy you would expect in a deep friendship. And so there can be so much about them that is shrouded and really unclear. If this sister died before Sunny could get that sanctity and comfort of closeness with her, of actually having grown up with her and gotten to know her over this long span of time and gotten to go through all of those stages of relationship with her, then she must be a kind of blankness, a kind of person on the outskirts whose sole character is in intermittent meetings. And that's exactly what you get in the fantasy. You go through this journey, you go through all these scary places, you're out with your friends and you're exploring with them, and you get to see her only every once in a while in between. She's that little punctuation in the middle of all of these broad clauses of life. that mystery is not the thing carrying you forward in the same way. You still have some mystery, right? Because there's something going on with Basil now. The pain that you're thinking about is potential pain. What's happening to these friends as a result of this loss? The pain that I am focused on is something residing long ago, a precursor to this character that I don't yet understand. That's two very different ways of suffering. There's the kind of suffering of I went through something and that has affected me because now that's a part of my life story, so now I identify myself with what that was. And then there's the pain of anticipation, of worry, because you're now worrying about what is the cascading result of all this. How can I handle it? Worry over, am I ready for this? And then it becomes this additional kind of machination in the mind. That's a completely different experience. The game has such a strong thematic turn, depending on if you open that door or you don't. I feel like our interpretations of the game might diverge drastically too, because the whole time that I was looking at Sonny and thinking about the point of this game is to discover who he is in relation to an event. Like some event is what defines him as he is now. And so for you, that's not what this game is anymore. The friends must be more important now, or what they're going through. The game is all contrast all the time. If you look at it, it's just that kind of cheesy, nostalgic, old school vibe through and through, right? It's just very consistently. The thing that's subversive about it is the ways in which it looks childish, and then of course it upends that expectation by being quite serious and dark. This game is just constantly about subversion, and in that same way, like you can subvert even the thematic relationship that you have with the game by your choice to overcome your fear and open the door. Now, presumably, our experience is going to be similar because we are returning to the fantasy world. After the little interlude with Sonny, where he overcomes his fear and he learns how to focus by facing off against that ghoul, you then return back to the fantasy. You eventually travel to Firefly Forest. In this place, it grabs onto some of the additional associations that a young child might have. Prior in this game, there's been, in the Otherworld location, all of these 80s associations, these attachments to this is what a kid would know about pop culture in that world. And when you get to Firefly Forest, there's a little bit more hints of folklore kind of mixed in. There's one point you throw clams into the water and then that allows you to meet a weeping willow. The weeping willow is a type of tree that's often associated with mourning in various folktales. The term knock on wood actually initially referred to a willow tree because the idea was the bark around the willow tree is so protective that it can protect any secret. And if you were to knock on wood, it doesn't have to escape this room. That was the whole logic. We're getting like these hints of folklore and other aspects of the real world entangled inside of this mind of the child. And so the next fear that you're overcoming is fear of spiders. There are various spiders throughout this forest and you have to get past them. You have to get past their spider webs in order to get this minecart track. And you build the track by solving these little puzzles. It's the most gamey part of the game. I don't know how you felt about it, but like it felt to me like, okay, these are just little kind of box puzzles, but they weren't dungeons or very complicated. It was just kind of like, how do I very quickly access these items? And then I just rushed through. There wasn't a lot to analyze there. You end up in the Sprout Mole Town. The perspective shifts where suddenly it's a 2D side scroller. It's almost like Zelda 2 where you're going up and down ladders and there's little rooms and it's just side-scroller adventure. You're meeting all of these sprout moles. The sprout moles are these enemies that kept popping up throughout the game, but prior to entering the Firefly Forest, you actually saw a group of them and they're all freaking out because there was going to be the appearance of Sweetheart, who's like some kind of pop star that everyone's obsessed with. And so I got the sense that these sprout mole characters are just these faceless masses of audience, of crowd. They kind of represent the populace in general. Certain characters are actually differentiated, but these sprout moles are like all one and the same. They're characterless. They seem to me like just symbolic of general fandom, of fanaticism, of people sort of devoting their whole lives to one single thing. And in this case, it's this Sweetheart character. And they're just completely hyped up about this performance that she's gonna give. And it is a theater performance for her to find a love. There was this space boyfriend guy, this guy who was completely consumed by the loss of his girlfriend, and you have to find him a mixtape, and it turns out that the finding of the mixtape is actually the very thing that pushes him deeper and deeper into his sorrow. The mixtape itself is actually attached to the songs that they shared with one another. So you're thrusting onto him memories that he wants to escape from, and that makes him even angrier, and it also reveals to you that he's actually Space ex-boyfriend. And he was the one who was dating Sweetheart. So they had this little love affair and it dwindled and it died off. Sweetheart is now still looking for love, and you're watching this theater performance, and you find out that Hero gets chosen by Sweetheart. Now, what you said about the city actually makes that much more interesting. Hero is much more of an enigma to Sunny/Omori than I thought. I assumed Hero was equal to all the other friends, but maybe Hero is so flat of a character because that's how Sunny knows him. Sunny only knows Hero as the person who was dating his sister. It's interesting that Hero becomes propositioned by this Sweetheart to then date. The way that Sunny knows this character is as, oh, he's just the boyfriend guy. He outright rejects her, and perhaps that's Sunny/Omori's wishful thinking for the Hero to stay pure. Hero can't say why he won't be with Sweetheart, but it seems very clear that he just is closed off in his heart to a new relationship. That leads to you entering the dungeon in this whole Sweetheart space.
This complicated relationship between Space ex-boyfriend and Sweetheart definitely takes on like a different implication to me as someone who is now primed to think about how all of this relates to the real world. If this story about the ex-boyfriend and Sweetheart are actually related to the real world, it might be that this is a representation of like maybe a divorce that happened. Because I do know that Sunny doesn't have his parents at home generally. He seems like he's part of a broken home perhaps. This whole storyline of trying to get them back together seems like something that kids would actually do in some way in real life when they want their parents to get back together. Now that I know that there's this real world that is an actual anchor point for all of this, I want to know what is the connection between what's really going on and how Omori interprets that.
We know that the real world is the projector that's leading to the projection of this fantasy. We have to wonder, what is the part being played by these various characters in this fantasy stage play of Sunny/Omori? What is he trying to grasp and play with, where he gets to recreate situations and change them, make different kinds of choices? So we're getting this with that relationship, this broken-hearted love that fell apart. Sweetheart is trying to maneuver outside of that and remain kind of above it all. Alternatively, Sweetheart is also just, we end up down into this castle and we actually get to see the purity of over-the-top decadence that Sweetheart seems to engage in. And whenever I see decadent characters, right, these characters who are so obsessed with appearance, you even go into the library at some point and you find out that all the books are glued shut, that there's just thousands and thousands of books, but you can't actually open them and read them. They're all entirely for show. This person who is so over the top, seemingly confident, seemingly sure of themselves, seemingly got it all figured out, is exactly the least confident person you can imagine. The most self-conscious individual whose insecurities then latch onto every kind of superficial, placating reassurance that they could find. That becomes about, for a character like Sweetheart, the love of mass of idiots. These sproutmos do not individualize like adults. They're highly impressionable and they're just following along with the comforting assurance of crowds. What everyone else is doing, oh, that's approval that I can like this thing. And Sweetheart is getting that same kind of reassurance from appealing to that. It's insecurity just manifested to the extreme. A lot of the characters in this game are taking whatever part of themselves is most afraid, and they're reacting to the world on the basis of that fear, and they're letting it control them. Sweetheart's insecurity becomes the entire basis of her personality. It becomes about, give me approval, make me feel better. Fulfill my greed in such a way so that I can feel as if I'm deserving of it, and I can have that reassurance that you want me to have it because I'm just so much better than you. And of course, the self-selection that occurs of the only people that you allow yourself to be worshipped by are babies. It doesn't come to the forefront in their mind as like the obvious thing. That's always the sad thing. When you see a figure whose entire personality becomes about how popular they can be, there's something deeply sad about that, in the sense that they're clearly very uncomfortable with being alone, uncomfortable with some aspect of their self. They're clearly not satisfied by the quiet, the space between all of the reassurances of someone else's smile and attention to you. And it's as if lack of attention from someone else becomes something really scary, because then you're stuck with what you are inclined to attend to, and perhaps that's a part of yourself you don't want to admit or you don't want to face or deal with. We get to go through this really grindy section of the game, probably one of my less favorite parts of the game. We go through section by section of her castle. We have to accomplish all of these little goals, and it's very clear that it's just like a series of chores or jobs to get to this battle with Sweetheart. But what we're learning along the way is, I think, what's important. What we're learning is she's a really insecure character. She's surrounding herself by other insecure characters, because all of these sprout modes, we get to know little bits of their personality, and they're just trying to follow along as best as they can. There's something really sad about that. And again, this game is just constantly circling around the vices that people hold on to that becomes their whole character. The ways in which our emotions can be so dictatorial on our capacity to overcome them, and it really becomes our whole identity, whatever emotion we lash onto. Again, even the combat puts emotions front and center. Your entire ability to win or be defeated is emotional. That part of your life is the most prominent.
In Sweetheart's Palace, we're kind of seeing an illusion within an illusion. This entire world that is constructed in Omori's mind is a palace of his own design that is being used as a way of sorting things out in the simple form that he can manage, that he can emotionally deal with. That same crutch is being used by this character, Sweetheart. She's another form of somebody who would rather put on a show, literally in her case a show, than simply engage with what people's opinion really is, what people's contribution is to her life. She doesn't want them to contribute anything that she hasn't pre-approved. Whatever this story ends up meaning in the end, it's almost a hint that Omori understands that there's a way to take this too far, that there's a way to imagine your way into a deeper and deeper pit of ignorance.
The ways to be consumed by fantasy is not merely in your mind. It can also be by what you construct in your own world. Sweetheart constructed a fantasy in her castle. She made sure that those who surround her reinforce that fantasy. Even when she's rejected, at some point she gets rejected by Hiro. She invites him to be her new boyfriend and he says no. And she gets angry, but she doesn't just get angry. She doesn't just admit that anger stems from hurt. She creates a story. She says that Hiro is just jealous of her, that's why he doesn't want to date her. This game Omori, if there's any value in it beyond the story it's trying to tell, and I believe most stories have a value beyond merely the pleasure of hearing the story, it's that what we're witnessing with this Omori character and the detailed, elaborate machinations that he lives in, what we're learning through that is that we also make those machinations in our own life. We can sit and think that we're gaining a valuable skill by getting really good at something that only applies to us, or we just play a video game for 1,000 hours and we get really good at that thing. And then we can think that makes us good at other things, and it doesn't, because we're not putting ourselves in actual competition with the real world. We can create an illusion of confidence and an illusion of ability, but if we don't actually put the thing out there, then we've not really tested that. And that is a kind of fantasy world outside of the mind. Omori and Sunny, that little parallel where it keeps flipping back and forth, everything that Sweetheart's doing and everything that Space Boyfriend was doing, it's all the same habit of not facing what's actually causing your pain and instead pushing it out there so that you don't have to admit it. We talked in the prologue about these other characters that we saw. Like, there was a character that was obsessed with television. There was a centaur called Small who was just collecting all of his awards for being small. There was someone whose entire life was devoted to being the top fan of Sweetheart. Each of them found one thing that they could take pride in, and then they stopped there. Instead of taking pride in something and then thinking, oh, since I was able to accomplish that, maybe I can accomplish something else, they put themselves in this position of, oh, this proves to me that I'm great, and I'm gonna fall on that fantasy and hold on to it. The only reason you would hold on to the past like that is because you really believe you can't do it again. And this is the challenge of all artists. One of the things that I'm starting to realize as we make these videos, there's an advantage in just making something. There's an advantage in the world in just committing 100% of yourself into something and actually aiming high, actually being pretentious, actually being kind of a dork about what you care about, and actually being passionate about something. Because so many people would much rather imagine that perfect idea. They can have that perfect idea and save it for later, and it's always like, oh, I'm just gonna hold on to it and I'll just do it later. I'll do it some other day. It'll be that thing that I fulfill for myself at some point. And there's a huge advantage in taking your best idea and just doing it now, just making it. Doing the best thing that you can do right now and actually just doing it and just keep doing it, and actually do the really, really scary thing, which is admit to yourself that the only reason you're not doing it is because you're really scared of the fact that you might not be able to and that you might suck at something. When you actually are doing something, if you continue that momentum, you might actually discover that the thing you were afraid of was just you locking yourself in a box and you making yourself scared. You actually are capable of succeeding again. It doesn't have to be one time like that. It's very very obvious that the game is trying to be symbolic. There's all this influence on the child mixed in. All of these characters are representative of things that he's struggling with in his life. And so we have to think about like these personalities. What are they representing about our own fixations and our own stigmas and our own taboos that we attach to ourselves in order to stay locked and not be able to get out of our own box? And then we blame everyone else for having closed the door when we didn't even try to open it.
Now that there are only 2 days left before this big move, Sunny and Kel have to make the most of their time together, and they go out to town to run an errand. Specifically today is another big day because Kel's older brother Hiro is coming home from college today. So they want to welcome him home with a little party, little get together. And so you have to go to the store. The only reason I mention this next part about them picking up something from the store is I do think it's a really clever, subversive moment. I think the game is full of this, of turning even the real world situations into kind of a stranger than fiction demonstration of how we assume one thing and then everything has a completely different meaning than what we expect. When they go to this pizza parlor to pick up food for his older brother Hiro, they pick up some sandwiches. The guy behind the register is frustrated as usual that his family keeps picking up sandwiches instead of pizzas from his pizza place. And Kel mentions, well, as long as we can remember, Hiro has really liked sandwiches, which is why we gave him his nickname, Hiro. He's named after the Hiro sandwich. It's an amazing thing, right? Because he also has this other quality of being very versatile, very charming and everything, but that's not where that comes from. We have this prophecy in our head of, oh, he's going to be heroic because we know that he's Hiro. You almost wonder how much of his magnanimous nature comes from him coincidentally being called Hiro. The meaninglessness of that is actually lost on him, and he actually interprets it as like a duty to be heroic. You can also visit Mari's grave, a place behind the church where they keep the graveyard. Her gravestone prompts a little conversation with Kel, where he talks about Hiro's reaction to her death, because they were very close. He says that after she died, he was usually in his bed and he refused to eat. He didn't cook anymore. He didn't take care of himself very well. He says that this went on for almost a year, despite their efforts to get through to him, tell him they miss him, be as supportive as they can. One of these nights, Kel attempts again to get through to his brother, and he's trying to pick the right words, but instead they're just making Hiro angry. He gets really angry at Kel and he starts shouting at him until not just Kel but both of them are crying and he's screaming through the tears. And then this brings their parents into the room. They rush in and they immediately start hugging Hiro. There's this moment where that changes everything in Hiro. He actually becomes his old self. He notices that they skip right past Kel, who's also crying. He runs over to his brother and he's apologizing profusely and he's hugging him, and ever since that day he got much better. He was almost turned back into himself by that moment where he had an opportunity to take responsibility for something.
I'm hearing this all for the first time. I know nothing about this aspect of Hiro at all from my playthrough. My playthrough in this fantasy world strictly is Hiro is probably the flattest character of all of them, right? He is the most simplistic archetype of protagonist numero uno, and he's just the one. He should have been the hero of this story, but of course you're stuck playing Omori. There's even a point in this chapter where he's the number one worker at this job. Even when he's transitioned into a totally different context, he's still the best of the best at that thing. What I like about that real world segment is you're getting the flip side of what it means to have your act together. And that is when you start to break down from the outside, people can recognize what's broken in you because you appeared whole. When someone who is prone to crying or prone to self-destructive behavior or prone to being in a bad headspace, when someone like that is going through something, it can be glossed over as insignificant because it's just another mark in that person's life. It's just indicative of who they are. Hiro, he's going through this thing where he's at this low point and he's actually experiencing the break from that character, from being this superiorly charming individual. And then of all the people to receive support, he is the one most equipped to be fine without anyone else. And yet he is also the one who's likeliest to get support because it is so clearly visible what is wrong with him. It's now the deviation from the norm, which is him living normally. It loosely reminds me of, I think it was in Infinite Jest or one of David Foster Wallace's short stories, which for anyone who doesn't know, David Foster Wallace was a depressively minded person. He dealt with all sorts of issues in terms of his mental health. He had to be on medication for a long time, and he struggled with the effectiveness of that medication and also just how to balance relationships in his life. And he talks about how often being depressed can feel worse because you wish that what you were going through was something other people can see. When people see someone like being electrified and you can see all the sparks from that electricity hitting their body, it's like, okay, I know exactly what's causing that pain, so I can fix it. I can shut off the power source and then solve that problem. If someone else is going through the same level of pain, but the electrical spark is invisible, the flame that's burning their body is something that we can't see, the blame then gets put on them. Oh, well, what's wrong with you? It doesn't feel external, so then we presume, well, it must be internal, therefore it must be your fault. Even though in both cases, it's something that feels outside of your control. Hero reminds me in that description of someone whose suffering is easily understandable and therefore it's cared for enough for people to want to solve. Kel already being someone who just doesn't amount to the same level of stability, well, him being unstable, well, that's just his fault. When Hero's unstable, it's not his fault. That's clearly a break in his character. What's really sad about that, about all of them going up to Hero, they're both crying. Whatever the pain is, whatever the suffering is, even if you could make a case that one suffering has a better reason, it's still suffering. Who are we to decide that one doesn't require reassurance? They obviously both do. So then this Hero character is seeing this weird relationship to his suffering in comparison to his brother's. Perhaps it's another mark of his deeply perfected emotional persona, but he seems to recognize the injustice of that moment. I would like to think it's the injustice of any kind of varying treatment dependent on who is just suffering in the right way versus who is not. There is a way in which we can be a victim of something in just the right way to get a lot of sympathy. We can be hurt by something and react the wrong way and get no sympathy, but the hurt is the same. It's a similar kind of starting point.
After they get home, they're visited by Basil's caretaker, and she says that Basil's missing, much like he's already missing in the dream world. They go to the park to find him, and they hear him screaming nearby, and they find Aubrey's scooter gang of kids. They find them all around Basil, but they're just sort of explaining to him that they're not trying to be mean to him, that they're just trying to make him leave because this is their secret spot, and they don't understand why he's screaming all of a sudden. You get into a little fight, you can pepper spray them, and then they all disperse. After that, it's just Basil, Aubrey, Sunny, and Kel alone together. Aubrey, just like the last time you talked to her, is basically bringing up that she thinks you guys are all really messed up, that you all abandoned each other as friends around the time that Mari died, and that you should have been there for each other. She's angry at you. She seems to be especially angry at Basil for some reason. She doesn't explain why. Basil shouldn't show his face. They're next to this lake, and in her anger she pushes him, and then he accidentally falls into the lake, which then makes her shyly back off because she didn't actually mean to do that. He can't swim, he's like sinking to the bottom of the lake, and Sunny has to go in after him and overcome his fear of drowning. But ultimately, Sunny fails to actually swim because he doesn't know how to swim either. Hero appears just in time to save the both of them, because apparently he had heard when he got home that Sunny and Kel had gone off to the park, so he wanted to see where they were. That is an interesting moment that I do want to point out, just because there seems to be this theme in this chapter of seeing a lot more of what people are capable of, like what these characters really are in the real world. Hero is so much more complex in this chapter than he is in the previous ones, in the dreams and in recollection. Aubrey now she seems angry, but she has something to be angry about that she's not really explaining fully. And she doesn't really want to hurt people as badly as she is. She didn't mean to push Basil into the water. There's this feeling generally around Aubrey that she doesn't know how to express her feelings. She's hurting people, even though that's not really the role that she wants. She doesn't want to be a bully.
It's the difference between the fantasy version of these characters and the real world one that reveals a lot about the Omori character that maybe isn't made explicit. All of the problems that I know of in relation to Aubrey is exclusively just bickering over small trivialities. She comes across as simplistically annoyed at things all the time. It's not over anything. And she isn't given much emotional undercurrent of complexity. Seems like, oh, that's just her character trait, and it doesn't require a precursor to that trait. She just is that thing. The real world version of Aubrey, the effects of her choices or the outcome that becomes her outbursts actually has a history, at least a suggested one. The decisions that she's making fold onto a fuller human being. There's a rationality behind why they have a problem. I don't know anything about Basil. For example, it's interesting to me that Basil is missing in the real world too. That's surprising to me that he was lost in some way. I kind of assumed that Basil being lost in the fantasy thing and us needing to get this character back was just some way to suggest regret over something with that character. But then the fact that it's actually happening in the real world where he's also disconnected suggests that maybe it's revealing something else about that Basil kid.
At this point, the only thing we would know about Basil from the real world sections is just that he's taken care of by this woman named Polly in his house because for one reason or another, his parents aren't there. He's in a similar situation to Sunny, in the sense that for unknown reasons, the parents are out of the picture, at least temporarily. And we know that he has his grandma who lives in his house also. Polly is the caretaker for both Basil and his grandmother. That's about all we know at this point.
It also sounds like the friends are disconnected more often in the real world. Because in the fantasy one, they're all with Omori practically the whole time. It's only in this chapter that they're actually separated from him, right? Because other than that, it's been like this grouping, this typical like 4-party role-playing group that fights together, and even the combat system, it integrates their emotional state into the strategies that you utilize. So it's like you're really working with this group in tandem and you're all equal to one another. In the real world, that is not the case. The fact that he has them all attached to him suggests that them now being disparate is a great loss for this character. And we know that this character is isolating himself and actively trying to avoid degrees of pain. Your character having gone out into the real world, they're more facing some of that, and maybe a piece of that pain is that friendship disbanding.
Now, your party size has literally gotten bigger. Now that Hiro has rejoined, he decides that they should spend some time with Sunny because he's going to be moving out soon, so they decide to have a little sleepover at his house. Kel and Hiro create a little pillow fort for themselves in Sunny's room. That's pretty much how that day ends.
There's something sad about hearing that he actually has a sleepover and gets to like have that little tent experience with his friends, because it kind of feels like my Sunny, the hikikomori Sunny, the one who's staying inside, is actually missing out on beautiful moments of youth, the high points. There's not a variety of tones to what's happening. It's just sort of one register of emotion, and that is listen to the voicemail, do the chores, go back to sleep. Every day is the same. It's kind of the white space in real life where it's just consumed by the same thing. It's such a different experience that I'm wondering why. And Hiro is actually a model of resilience for this Sunny character, because Hiro lost his girlfriend. Mori's passed away, which is something you know in your playthrough and I don't, not yet. So Hiro is actually showing how viable it is to be okay with loss, to actually move on and not have it be this thing that tows you down deeper and deeper into a kind of chasm of your own making. So much of that is life experience in his case, right? He's lived longer than all of these other kids, and at the point that Omori's lost this person who means the world to him. I wonder if that makes Omori sadder to see this person who's supposed to love his sister just like him be able to move on seemingly so well. His need to help others becomes a way for him to not have to deal with his own pain anymore. And then he actually gets to become a better version of himself, because in the act of charitably helping someone else through pain, you actually become superior to their pain in some way. You know, those are the kinds of thoughts that people have when they're depressive, right? They can see the ways in which when someone's trying to help them, they can make you feel worse because they seem better in comparison to you even more. It's almost like rubbing in your face your inability to cope. Sunny, being out in this world, he's dealing with someone who's actually thriving in this space. Perhaps that's a part of why it is so scary to actually go out into the world, because Sunny isn't dealing with it very well. He's actually maybe dealing with it really, really badly. That's probably one of the worst things about grief or any kind of emotion, is there's no permission to stop. You could just feel the pain forever and ever and ever. Part of the benefit of having other people around you is they actually give you at least some kind of point where it's like, okay, now we can feel better about this thing. That's the whole point of a ritual, like a funeral. You go there and you're suffering and you're going through all this grief, and then it's like, okay, we're going to do this ritual, and then at the end of this thing, there's going to be an actual end point. Here's the point where you have permission to just let this thing go, because otherwise all emotions are never ending, especially when you're locked in your own mind. What's really to stop you? Because you are yourself the one who locked yourself in the first place. You're not likely to be in and of yourself the one to get you out. It's so tempting to go inward when we have a problem because we trust ourselves the most, but so many problems are self-imposed and the trust is misplaced. The people that it is most tempting to distrust are kind of the only ones who can actually give us something hard to hit, something actually almost physical in its solidity. Look, this is it. You have to stop. Hiro is almost that person. We have to get past the grief. The grief has to die. Grief only serves a purpose up to a certain point. At some point, you have to actually do something else. Sunny is actually facing up against someone who's actually making them deal with the fact that the really horrible fact about grief, which is grief is tempting. Being sad, it's not just this thing that just happens to us. There's a kind of weird addiction to sadness. Until someone else comes along to see you for what you are, which is a kind of addict to something, there will be no stopping point. That's my experience in the game. The Hikikomori run is this character literally going deeper and deeper and deeper into their own mind and having no one to stop them, and just actually fully embracing some of the actual understandable, reasonable temptation that can be found in suffering and being the one to suffer. In my playthrough, I don't meet anyone. The only sense that I have is my mother is very, very busy and can only communicate with me in notes or voicemail messages. There's all these boxes strewn throughout. I have to do chores throughout the house to maintain the place. It's mostly an empty home because it seems like I'm going to move out at some point. When I went back into the real world after all the fantasy stuff, I did notice a slight change in the relationship that was happening between Sunny and his mother. And that slight change was just in the voicemail message. She leaves a message telling him that she's worried about him. She expresses some kind of like emotional attachment to him, which I hadn't seen in any of the notes. There wasn't like a lot of like intimacy in that way. She mentions his feelings and kind of being worried about him. She shows concern. And then she suggests to him that it's okay if he doesn't want to visit his friend Kel yet. She says this in the little voicemail. It's okay if you don't want to go outside. That little tiny hint of that relationship I thought was interesting because it made me think about the ways in which acceptance can sometimes make the problem feel big in a new way. He's already intimidated by going out into the real world. She tells him, "Oh, I understand your feelings. I understand what you're talking about." Of course, that's really important to have a relationship with someone else about your feelings and what you feel, but it also legitimizes the fear a little bit. The support system around him can accidentally reinforce that, at least a little bit. There's this concept called catastrophizing. It's a bad habit that people have where something really bad happens to them and it's objectively bad as far as anything can be objective. Rather than accept the badness as a part of living or just a part of failure or choice, rather than viewing it as just a mere failure among many in between successes, it's viewed as some character defining moment, as something that now my whole self is changed, now my whole identity is attached to this thing. The habit of catastrophizing is treating things not just as bad, but as defining. When the mother left this little message about, "Oh, it's okay that you're scared, you don't have to see your friend or do anything like that," it kind of felt like a natural, logical first step in the process of catastrophizing something difficult and making it so much worse than it actually is. It isn't to say that you can't be supportive of each other, but I know how seductive it is to slip into not having to be uncomfortable. When someone makes it feel like you have a lot of permission to stay in that comfortable space, that to me is the beginning of never getting out. Because of course you're going to stay in that comfortable space. Like, why ever leave if no one's going to make you leave? It's that sad, inevitable failure of parenting that has to happen in order for someone to grow, is the parent at some point has to just let go, let you mess up really bad for your own sake. But of course, all of this is, to me, in my little playthrough, like a little trickling of characterization. I'm only getting a tiny taste of what's going on. The whole rest of this chapter is just teasing out further and further explanations.
It is a touchy subject what you're talking about, but I think I know what you mean, because there are definitely times in my life when I wish that somebody hadn't told me that closing doors was the best option, right? That choosing not to expand myself was actually somehow brave in its own way. People will sometimes twist that in an effort to make you feel good, which is obviously a good intention. In the moment, it feels great because it allows you to just relax, accept that, oh, I'm just incapable of this. Oftentimes, it creates this sense of regret looking back where you realize if that person hadn't said that, I wouldn't have been able to justify backing down so easily. I remember in high school, my principal was this really garrulous guy who's always hitting us with these off-the-cuff speeches, and he was actually very inspiring to the kids, and we all took a lot of advice from him, most of which was about caring about other people and working hard and doing your best. But there was one little moment of his speech that even at the time I felt was giving people the wrong idea about how to improve themselves. He basically said, your friendships right now will not matter, and so you should focus on school rather than your friends. I definitely understand to an extent what he was saying. You should take this seriously if you're going to do it at all. But I knew for myself that he was justifying something that I was already comfortable with. I was already very comfortable with focusing on school rather than expanding my social skills. When I heard that, I thought, I don't want to give myself permission to not take my friends seriously, because I will if left to my own devices. If I had any weakness at that time, my grades were fine. The issue was I felt isolated, and I knew that that was largely my own fault. That was a unique moment where even before I had the benefit of hindsight, I was able to see this would make me feel good to take this advice, but I really shouldn't.
That's a really important aspect of these people who get stuck, place of stagnancy in terms of emotional growth. It's really reasonable to stay in that space. You as an adult giving advice to someone, your advice of course makes sense within a certain logic, but it's like, what kind of goal do you want to have? In the case of telling someone, look, keep in mind these friends aren't going to be your friends when you start a career, that's obviously true. They're not going to have to live with the consequences of your life. So of course you shouldn't put them in the forefront of your priorities. But at the same time, it's also true that that problem of dealing with people exists perpetually with or without the specifics of who you're dealing with. And those skills of actually socializing, those skills of actually discovering something about yourself in pursuit of that pleasure, actually knowing what it is to balance that pleasure with other things, to balance the relationships with other people and work. There does seem to be this pressure to be a certain way, and also a pressure to be okay with yourself. Of course, that's perfectly rational and reasonable, and we can understand that. But just like how we talked about in the Outer Wilds thing, logic doesn't carry its own goals. You have to always be juggling within yourself, what do I actually want to pursue? Even if the advice is reasonable, is it going to be a trade-off where I lose something else in that process? In your case, the principal is giving you advice on how to do really well in college. The kind of world where you could be successful is far less contingent on just getting a degree in quite the same way. There's different choices happening now. It makes perfect sense. Your principal is just like the mother. It makes perfect sense to either steer someone in a direction of a certain kind of guaranteed well-being and or steering someone in a direction of comfort. In both cases, there is something also being lost. If you don't deal with that too, if you're not somehow offering the person enough awareness of what they're also losing so that they can maybe make that choice, you are actually taking something away from that person. There's a risk involved there. Right when you go back to the fantasy world, the whole world is shrouded in fog and all of your friends are gone. They kind of grew up without you. Just like the real world example with Hiro figuring out how to emotionally deal with things, you go back into this fantasy world and Omori is trying to process the fact that people have jobs now, people sign contracts. It's viewed in the typical way of, okay, well, that is just pure misery. I need to save them from this life that they're now stuck in. They're now stuck in the job life. And I need to get them out of that. So you go down into this deep well. There is a lost highway, a stretch of endless road, and then you have the last resort casino, which I love that it's called last resort because that sounds like exactly the kind of final option that life feels like. If I can't make it that dream version of what I want my life to be, I will just end up falling back into the grind like everyone else. That grind of commuting on the highway, that grind of holding in all of my feelings and drives and passions and just working a dead-end job, just working that job every single day. It feels like these next areas are thematically linked. The deep well to me is that repression of emotion. You go into the space and it's just really deep down and you can't access it easily. And that is you giving up whatever hopes and dreams that you have. And then the long highway with all the taxis that take you from place to place, that just becomes that feeling of smallness in the bigness of a city. Just commute and just travel and it being so samey, that kind of boringness of it. And then you also have the last resort, which is just the job. The reason why I think this whole chapter is linked in that way with these three main concepts and being a way to communicate a disinterest in work and a disinterest in becoming an adult and actually growing up is one thing that has to be the case when you have a story taking place inside of a character's mind. mind is it almost dictates a particular kind of focalization in narrative. That is the point of view that the narrative is witnessed. Every story has a narrator. If it's in first person view, the narration is obviously from the character, so the point of view is limited to that character's perspective. There's various third person narrations, and of course we know the limited and the omniscient, all these different kinds of third person perspectives. There's also what's called focalization. When we're playing these role-playing games, we are looking at Omori from the outside. We're not seeing it from his point of view. But the narrative, even though it is looking at him from the outside, it is still in what's called an internal focalization, in that even though it has access to the information outside of the character, it is still seeing what the character is seeing. It is still witnessing the world from their point of view, even though it is omniscient in the sense of having an ability to grasp information that the character doesn't necessarily have access to. And so the whole time I'm playing through this fantasy world, I'm thinking, what is this focalization of these metaphorical places, these types of environments, these types of interactions? What are they saying about this character? Even though it's not in the character's eyes, we know that it's supposed to represent the character's mind. Why are they fixated on these things? What can we learn about this character based on those fixations? And what can we especially learn about this character that this character doesn't necessarily realize about themselves? All of that is a preamble to why I found The Last Resort both very revealing and very sad in a particular way. You go into the deep well, you go through the long highway, you end up in the last resort place, and it's just the casino. And the essence of gambling is you have all these people and they're hooked and they're tethered to machines and they're able to have a never-ending pursuit without satisfaction. Satisfaction is the end of that whole experience, and the fact of being there is a constant pursuit of satisfaction, not really a gain of it. A hedonic treadmill, right? It just goes in circles again and again. You're always seeking and seeking, but you're never pleased. When I go into this casino, I'm just sort of thinking about all of these people locked into their little machine, just doing the slots, doing it again and again. That is a kind of hikikomori that's approved of. Being addicted to the right thing, getting really, really good at your job, wanting to get married, wanting to have kids, wanting to do all of these things that are approved of forms of pursuing a kind of satisfaction and being engulfed by it in an acceptable way. Other people get locked into their own different things. I didn't intend to bring up David Foster Wallace again, but he talks about the religion we devote ourselves to, whether we're religious or not. You could be an atheist, you don't have to believe in things as a point of fact, but you could still devote yourself to things and take it for granted. You devote yourself to the things so fully that it doesn't seem like a separate sphere of something to devote yourself to. It doesn't seem like there was even an option. It just seemed, well, that's obviously the thing. We could be so judgmental of people who don't want to socialize or people who don't want to put themselves out there as being weak in some way. But the inclination of those who do want to go out and do want to have a job and do want to get married and have kids, that's a kind of luck that their inclination just so happened to fit into society as it is. And it's a kind of bad luck that the other person's inclination lean them toward insular activities. And the judgment seems unfair in that regard. It's a kind of moral luck, and that's a bit of a shame. I was thinking about that with The Last Resort and just seeing this place, all the people are there hooked up. Even the workers in The Last Resort, because you actually get to see all the gator workers, like they're alligators. And even them, when you go behind the scenes, you see them working and they're also addicted to stocks. You see them watching their stocks rise and afraid that it's going to fall. That's gambling approved. You have all these layers of different kinds of addictions. One addiction is pathetic, pulling the lever again and again. The other addiction is a sign of integration with your career and society and looking at the stocks going up and down. Oh, look, that's an improved gambling. Devoting yourself to something wholly and completely. Just like someone who's locked in the room is devoting to something, but they're devoting to the wrong thing.
Speaking broadly, something that I notice is that I think the complexity of the dream world is an example of how the dream world is actually undermining itself in a way. Oftentimes, when something is pursued completely and to an extreme, it actually undermines itself. That's sort of happening in this dream world because it is all presumably designed to distract Omori from the complexities of the outside world, but it's full of them. It's full of what he knows from the real world. It's full of actual human flaws. And so even in his attempt to escape the worries of it all, he is still creating an adventure for himself. It seems like the battle system is an actual diegetic thing within the dream. Like he thinks of the inside of his mind as a video game, even down to one of the bosses being a loading bar. When he goes to this last resort place and he fills it unconsciously with all of these adults who are stuck inside pulling a lever or looking at stocks or just working mindlessly. He's actually wrestling with the kind of person he wants to be, even though the whole point of this place is to stop thinking about all that stuff. It's easy to ignore that there's a lot going on there because of how cutesy it is. There's so much humor and so much lightheartedness to everything that it feels like, oh, this is all an escape. But if you really look closely, the escape, it's not really functioning the way it's supposed to. It's too thought-provoking to be a perfect escape for Omori.
Isn't that always the irony of any addiction? If you decide, oh, I'm sad, so I'm gonna drink to not be sad, but then it's the drinking that leads you to be sadder, and then you drink to not be sad. You think, oh, I want to feel fulfilled and have everything I want, and then you buy the new car, and on the second day you're excited about the car, but it's slightly less excited than the first day. On the fifth day you're excited about the car, but it's not as excited as the first day or the second day. You discover the nature of habituation. No matter how much we get what we want, the very nature of desire is to be self-perpetuating and not to stop. The person who wants to be fulfilled, by following through in the act of getting what they want, they're reinforcing the need to keep getting more in order to feel anything. It becomes a new kind of addiction. It's the same thing as the drug addict who is chasing that very first high, and the high is always diminishing no matter how much they take until eventually they overdose. It's this unacceptance of what is very obvious, which is that we evolved to keep moving forward. Because we're biologically bound creatures, because we have to eat and sleep and procreate, we are always future-oriented and not present-oriented, and it's going to mean that we are never satisfied. It also makes me think about when people are locked into a space and let's say they don't want to interact with people because it makes them anxious. They start to dive into activities that give them control. You play a video game and you're able to feel yourself gain expertise at something that's within a safe space of failure where you can fail without long-term consequences. You can just restart. You can feed into your anxiety, which is a kind of neuroticism, and you can feed into that neuroticism in a way that feels satisfying. And as you get better at that thing, it then makes all the times that you don't live up to that new mark now anxiety-inducing. You're kind of repeating the same thing that you were trying to avoid in the outside world, but now you're just repeating it inside of an insular space. Sometimes we can get into a habit of not action, a habit of reaction, and forget the goal. The goal was to avoid certain things, and the goal wasn't just to do the thing that looks like it's avoiding the thing. One really rough analogy is this sort of like if you're in an argument with someone, you raise your voice, and the point of raising your voice is to emphasize your meaning. But as soon as you raise your voice, you've just obfuscated your meaning, and it's now shrouded by you being angry, and now the person is only paying attention to you being angry. So much of behavior is that. This last resort place was also the last spot in the game where I really felt like the game was emphasizing the child's mind in creation of this place, because it's where the characters felt most like caricatures. All the workers, they would walk up to you and they're trying to sell you stuff all the time, and the notion of what stock prices are, it seemed very simplified. When you actually meet the boss at the very end, he seems like the archetype of the villain boss. He refuses to let Hiro go because Hiro is so perfect for his profits, because Hiro is the perfect employee, even though he doesn't actually pay Hiro out of these profits. Just this cartoon villain. The other aspect that I thought was interesting is this boss guy believed that he deserved all of this wealth because he had picked Hiro to be the worker there. It's kind of like that cartoon villain of a boss. Not only is the boss a jerk, but everyone underneath the boss can see that it's pure luck that put them there, but the boss can only see the merit. The boss is living his life as if none of the privileges that are so obvious and apparent exists in his point of view. It's all just meritocracy through and through. It's also the funny thing about being a child is so much of what allows the illusion of pure merit and the inability to see luck's involvement comes from the nature of status seeking and how people have ideas of what counts as status. And the whole basis of believing in status is believing in deserving of status. So if you have a high status, you must have deserved it. But being a child means that you don't fall into that trap because a child doesn't care about status. When that final boss battle was happening, I thought it was funny that there was an immediate cut through that it was so obvious that the boss doesn't deserve any of this. And that to me felt like what a child can see easily. oh, status doesn't mean anything, really. Status needs us to believe that it means something because otherwise status has no power. But so much of status is past oriented. Whatever was justifies itself, and it kind of doesn't really do any work to follow the genealogy of what led to that thing to actually discover whether or not it was deserved. That's kind of beside the point. You have the status, the hierarchy must be real, and we can't question it. Okay, this boss is a bullshitter, and no one else can see it because they're all in the system. It benefits them to stay in the system. If the boss has a high status, my status is linked to maintaining the system that gives them that status. And to a kid or to someone who never falls into that grind, the grind of the endless highway, the commute, and the work, it just looks silly. It looks like clown costumes in daily living. That is what you're seeing a little bit in this last resort place, is the carnival display, and it's this mutual play happening. We're all playing the same game so long as no one questions the game, because it really is a game. At any point we can stop. We made these rules. This Omori character is walking in and seeing right past it. The boss's assertions don't faze him at the end. We're just gonna defeat you and we're gonna get hero back, and you're obviously a cartoon villain. This is going to sound very much like I'm saying that the caricature is true, that there is no merit. Sometimes there is and sometimes it is luck, and that it's going to be a kind of mix of the two. But I just think it's funny that we have this simplified version of things that is both true in some cases and also completely false in other cases. But this character not actually living in the real world, not actually working, only has that kind of caricature. But it reveals something true. The distance is also truthful. This whole highway in this last resort, this was all like a detour to then go to the main route, which is to go deeper and deeper down into this coral reef. And it might be a nod to Dark Night of the Soul, going deep into the recesses of someone's unconscious. This is also when things start to get revealed. There's one point where you meet a psychic entity, this branch coral, that begins to answer the dreamer's questions. You can just ask it questions. What is the cat in the room, like right after the white space? And it talks about there's 3 cats, there's the oldest, there's the wisest, and there's the favorite. The favorite currently watches over the dreamer. It mentions how the white space is an empty void that the character's in, and you can just keep asking it questions and it will explain to you what the black bulb is, and it says that the black bulb in the white space is the repression of an idea. This is the first time in my playthrough where I started to get answers, and it was only going deeper and deeper into this recess of the mind that I started to get these answers. And it felt like, oh man, this game is going to finally satisfy me. It's going to give me everything I need to know. And it gives us just this big dump of information. There's this baptism in blood that happens where the character sinks into the water. Inside of this water, there is an apple within this red space, and you eat from the apple. It's like the apple of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. It implies that I'm about to get all these answers, but then the branch coral dies, and the soundtrack music, you can faintly hear voices in it, and then I just move forward. They took away from me any satisfaction. All the answers I got were really about the fantasy world. I was getting an understanding of who the cats were. I was getting a little bit of an understanding of the white space. I was getting all these answers about the fantasy world, and that was feeling satisfying. But of course, it was a bait and switch of what I really want to know, which is what happened in the real world, and the game wasn't giving me that. It felt like a climax, even though it actually wasn't. Suddenly I was getting all this information, and then it was taken away, and then I was back on the route.
And it almost feels like the purpose of it is to show you what you can't have. You're not going to get the answers. This is almost what it feels like to get the answers.
It ends up being a great example of how worthless information can be, even when it's like exactly what you want. Me finding out that there are 3 cats and one of them's the favorite, and the favorite is the one watching you in the white space room, that is certainly an answer, but it means nothing. It felt like I was being given exactly what I desired, and it was showing me how futile and pathetic my desires were. For my playthrough, it was the most satisfying, unsatisfying moment in the whole game. Felt like I was getting exactly what I wanted, and it was trying to show me what I had done to myself. It was like a precursor of what this ending is going to be for this Hikikomori character. You committed yourself to this fantasy, so here's the bullshit fantasy. This is what that is. If this whole world is in this character's head, all of the combat, all of the accomplishment, then it's as worthless as the information that you're gaining from it too. Which is kind of the challenge that anyone who's locked into their home and they get really good at video games. You know, this is a video game channel, but there's nothing really good about that. You could get the feeling of having done something in a space that guaranteed you were going to have that feeling, and so you didn't really have to do anything to get it. You just had to be. In the case of this fantasy thing, You just had to keep trudging along, and yeah, you would get answers, and yeah, you would level up and do all these things. But precisely because it's not real, it is tunneling you to that. It's not actually the accomplishment that it's trying to be an illusion of. Maybe that doesn't matter. I don't know. There's that thought experiment about, if you could be like in the Matrix where you find out that everything that you know is fake, whole family's not real, and every experience you've had is not real. Would you like to go into the real world? The only caveat is you go into the real world and you just lose everything that you care about, but at least it's real. Then it becomes a thing of like, well, what's the value of real at that point? Maybe I'm better off in something fake. Some people would say, no, I'd rather just stay in the fake. But some people think, well, the real thing is the only thing that really matters. But why? I don't have an answer to that.
Another difference between our playthroughs is the very beginning of this dream section. While I also saw that the whole playground area was empty and the world was covered in fog, I was led to the last resort through a longer detour that was led by Mari. Kel did not bring me to the last resort. Mari shows up on the pier next to the water. Mari says that your friends have been taken somewhere else. We should go search for them. You both dive into the water and you start swimming through it for a while. It opens up into this looping ocean section where if you go all the way to the right, then you end up on the left. There are a couple little islands there. One of the islands is a lighthouse where the light itself is gone, it's not working. The whole place is abandoned. It's full of decrepit household items and decay everywhere. It also has a portrait of Sunny's family that has been, almost looks like it's burnt or just very, very old. And then you can also visit this other little island that has a little bedroom that's equally abandoned looking, and it has a TV set. You can't see the screen of the TV set, but its description says that something stares at you from the other side of the screen. It's just this weird little detour where you can search through all that stuff. After reaching the other side of the water with Omori, she just expresses a few things that sound like something an older sister would say. She's proud of him for facing his fear of water to get all the way across it. She's concerned still that there remains something harder to overcome, she says. They arrive in front of this very large floating window curtain, and Mari says that Omori seems to have forgotten something. She says he's forgotten something and she wonders, is he okay with that? She says that when he originally saw that curtain, it was the last time they went to the lake. She says that this is her stop. She expresses that she's actually sorry that she came along. She knows that she's not supposed to. She's supposed to be outside of the whole group, but it gets a little lonely by herself. She says she hopes that Sunny is still in there. She's referring to him as Omori the whole time, but in this one moment, she says she hopes Sunny is still in there. And then the curtain opens and she sort of reveals a new form. She's wearing this ghostly white gown and she says goodbye. It's the last you see of her before you reach the deep well.
Well, that is a huge difference. It sounds like in your playthrough, that version of events offers Mori agency of someone separate from Omori. In my playthrough, Mori is just the caretaker in a safe picnic space, someone afar who has no real voice. She's only there in relation to you. But your version, it almost sounds like because your character, when he was Sunny, because that character went out and was engaging with the unpredictability of others, that nature of what other people are actually like, them doing things you don't expect, them doing things at odds with what you want, that translated back into the fantasy, lingered in there. Now this Mori character is also thinking for herself, actually is a character. Yours is so much more fleshed out than mine, because mine is, when I went through that sequence, it was just Kel taking me and saying everyone had a contract and they had their job, and there wasn't anything deviating from the clear direction of the plot. Yours sounds like it had something disconnected from the direct plot, but directly connected to the character. It's sort of like different styles of storytelling or different layers of storytelling. There's some stories where, and this is typically when someone writes a story for the first time, they don't actually have the characters be characters, they have the plot first, and then it's just the characters make decisions to keep going in that direction so that you can reach the right end that you set. Sounds like your version of the story was the more sophisticated level up, which is the plot is whatever the characters decide. The plot is the characters' desires intermingling with the challenges of life. What that entails emerges as the plot as opposed to the plot dictating everything that they do. Suddenly they actually are characters in your case. That sounds like a much more interesting version of that Mori relationship. At this point, my understanding of Mori is still very flat. I don't even know that she's dead yet. It almost sounds like you were getting this little interference from outside, someone trying to remind you that the story you're on, this fantasy one, isn't the one that matters. It's trying to like bring you back into what you actually have to deal with. In this case of what you know, you actually have to deal with her having died and this being the reason that you're in this fantasy. Perhaps it's precisely because he was outside of his house and actually dealing with other people that part has become infectious in his mind, bred out into the story that he's telling himself. There's something even sadder about that.
Hearing you spell it out like that actually clarifies to me something that I think we were both confused about, which is as the kids are going deeper into the deep well, people are starting to forget Basil. It's unclear why. They're forgetting that the whole point of this mission was to go find Basil. I just now realized hearing you talk about that maybe Basil is another example of the real world complexity escaping the dream logic, the dream plan. And the reason that they're forgetting Basil is because he actually wasn't part of this story. Basil left of his own accord, that he had his own real world reason for leaving. So it would kind of make sense that the world would be fighting back against that and just making people forget about Basil because that wasn't part of the plan.
The inconvenience of Basil deviating and getting lost really doesn't work well with the control that this environment even exists for. The whole point of this fantasy space is to offer Omori control over something in a space where he feels like he's missing that control in his real life. He's trying to get it here. And then Basil leaves again, and it's like, well, now you're the variable, and I didn't need a variable. The whole point is to have things be predictable. And then you having not been, well, now it's too complicated again. This is what happens, right? You're trying to get control, you're trying to make things predictable in the way that you want, but you also can get in your own way. It's hard to recognize how much of the problem is you. How much your blame for things outside of you is kind of missing the ways in which, even with full control, comes chaos underneath, because that's just the nature of information and how it coalesces and builds. That means you can't retain it all. You can't hold it all in mind. Maybe that's part of why they forget that Basil character at this point. It's an anomaly. It's an unusual moment, but it's clearly important because they mention it quite a few times. This is all leading into one of the final areas of Omori. It's a weird final area to have because it is also probably one of the silliest, but it's also potentially the most clear in its symbolism of what it maybe represents, and that is this Humphrey the Whale. This whole final sequence, as I've said, is focalized in the mind of an isolated individual imagining a world in their psyche filled with characters to interact with and filled with little metaphors of actual real-world considerations. The game goes, for me, in a totally unexpected direction with this final area in this fantasy world. We're in the deep well, which for me is a kind of metaphor of how deep this character now is in their own mind. How kind of stuck they are. Then we end up in this whale, which is as cartoonish a moment as I think the entire game has. I find it really odd to talk about this whale because my initial experience playing it, I was thinking this can't be the last place. Everything prior to this felt so much more grounded in something real. I'm going to give an interpretation now that I think might be seen as lending a whole lot of credence and sophistication to the sequence that maybe is unwarranted, maybe offering a lot more than maybe should be there. I guess I want to suggest one way that this Humphrey the Whale thing maybe kind of makes sense. It brings to mind what's called the implied author. You as an intentional reader, as someone looking at a work and taking the work seriously, the reason why it is reasonable to assume that there is a meaning ingrained in a piece is because you know that there was an author behind it. Knowing that there is an author behind something implies a wholeness to the narrative that wouldn't be the case if it was a collection of disparate parts. It would make sense, however, if you knew that all of those parts had the leadership of one individual, and then across all those different parts, there is an implication of wholeness. I'm bringing up this concept not just to justify why we are interpreting Omori so much the whole time, but also to suggest that there is an additional implied author at this point in the game. And that implied author is not just the creator of this game, which is Omocat and her team. The implied author here is Omori himself. So much of our interpretation is treating Omori as an author of this world in his mind. As he goes deeper and deeper into his psyche, he is also getting further and further away from the real world, which is exactly what he's trying to push himself away from. As he enters deepest into this well, he enters into a literal whale that is utterly absurdly cartoonish. He meets 3 witches. They're all working on experiments, and there's these parts of the whale that form as little bumps in his body. And those are all studying Omori and studying his friends and his whole group. And they're trying to make copies of things. It's as absurd as possible. And if there's any charitable interpretation, I think it would be that this is an example of this character at his most insular, almost too far gone. This character has gotten too deep into his own machinations to the point that now it is fully cartoon. The metaphor that stands out at the very end of this whole thing is that the boss that you're fighting at the very end is the whale having gotten too deep into itself as well. The whole last boss fight is you fighting a part of the whale that itself eats you and then has a part of itself inside of itself that then eats you and then has a part of itself inside of itself. It's this constant Russian doll nested character that you're going deeper and deeper and deeper into. You can't seem to get out. That to me is what Omori is doing at this point in the story. What felt odd to me is it is so light-hearted, this whole Humphrey the Whale section, and it's right directly at the edge of probably the darkest point in the whole game. Suddenly, all these revelations happen right after this sequence. If there's anything to suggest about that contrast, if it were purposeful, if we were taking the implied author seriously and thinking, okay, the creator of this game is trying to be holistic about their choices, well, maybe the intention of the contrast is to show the contrast to the truth, to the actual revelations that are to come about the real life of this character, is the most fantasy version of this character's mind. This character going deep, deep into their own psyche to the point of pure delusion, pure cartoon delusion in this case. This also connects to this quotation that gets thrown around by Roland Barthes called Death of the Author. Because death of the author is not to say that the author doesn't exist, it still presumes that there's an author behind the work. It's to say that the author's intention does not matter, because at this point, their text is now your text. It's death of a set meaning prior to your engagement with it. It still reinforces the notion that there is an implied, at least, wholeness to the work that you then are there to interpret and deal with. And this might be one of the challenges or one of the things that makes AI so odd. You and I have been looking at all these little chatbots. When I see the little chatbot responses, the word that comes to my mind is, oh, this is like bullshit from like a kid. And I think that sensation comes from seeing writing that is not authorial in the sense of trying to accomplish something as a whole. What it seems to be trying to accomplish is whatever prompt you give, it's just trying to be consistent with the prompt. It's not trying to elevate to some gestalt that amounts to more than the sum of its parts. It merely is a series of parts building one to the next, not necessarily with some ultimate outcome in mind. That's sort of this funny difference. That's also the importance of why we interpret the way that we do, why we sit here and take these games seriously on this channel. We are treating these games as created things and presuming a kind of wholeness that might be easy to take for granted as over-reading, but I think the danger of under-reading these works by not taking them seriously enough is also something to be concerned about and something to try to avoid. This Humphrey the Whale thing is potentially that kind of moment of Omori actually being an author himself and therefore constructing a narrative wherein he gets as far away from life as he can. That's his last straw before he's truly sucked into the horror of what he actually has to face. For both of us, this is going to branch off in such a way that the horror has a very specific effect on my version of Omori, and it's one that leads to a certain kind of end. As far as I know, it leads to a totally different effect on yours.
Talking to you about how you interpret that has been in many different parts of this story, really helping me come to some kind of interpretation of these otherwise very unpredictable and chaotic plot points. This dream logic sometimes seems like it's exploring absurdity for its own sake, but when you talk about it, it brings me back to some of the stuff that we've already noticed in previous parts of the story. We've already talked about how it seemed odd that the characters around Omori were forgetting about Basil for seemingly no reason, and how that seemed like it might be a way of showing that the author of this dream is having to adapt to changes that it didn't expect. It's taking the nuclear option and just deleting some of the input. Just saying, you know what, Basil actually isn't part of this story. I can't figure out a good way to accommodate him, so I'm just going to erase him. This additional layer of seeing Humphrey as another example of kind of floundering in the pursuit of improvisation, not having to respond to any external input or context because you have no access to it, and only responding to internal prompts. Your improvisational story can become increasingly mangled if it only gets to refer to itself, because it no longer is tethered to the rules of reality. The logical machine starts becoming less and less recognizable because it has no way of correcting itself based on truth in any way. I think the implied author here definitely seems, in multiple parts of this plot leading up to the end, to be showing how Omori is deteriorating as a storyteller. He's running out of road and he doesn't know how to finish this story.
What Omori is going through as a storyteller demonstrates one of the pitfalls of complete control without constraints. When you're not given a rule, like your story has to have this, this, and this, well then the difficult parts of your story you can erase. As he gets closer and closer to facing what it is that is prompting him to enter into this fantasy space, as he gets closer and closer to facing the very thing that we know he's running away from, he's slipping deeper and deeper into the absurd and into not needing to even think about Basil. It reinforces this idea that as this thing gets more and more absurd, that is not an example of the game throwing up its hands and saying, let me just be silly. It's actually predictable and in line with an honesty and truth to this character. We already know this character is exactly the kind of person who does run away from their problems and doesn't face them head on. Of course, in their own fantasy world, they would begin to run away doubly again, a deep spiral down, and we're sort of witnessing this happen. And yet, like anyone who tries to run away from their problems, you can't change all facts. There is a fact of the matter at bottom. The very thing you're running away from is a part of you, whether you like it or not, because you are, by definition, all the things in your past, just accumulated up. You're going to still have to suffer it. You having run away from it makes that suffering all the more acute because you have not done the work to prepare yourself for it, especially if you have a habit of always moving away from the harm. Well, now the harm is all the more significant. That's a charitable interpretation of the Humphrey the Whale section. This is the bottom for this character. If this character has an addiction, this is them fully consumed by it. And that addiction is the fantasy itself, wanting the fantasy to propagate over and above anything scary and real and painful. Precisely why they're in this predicament in the first place. We do this Humphrey battle. We do that deep, almost manifestation of psychosis in the battle with Humphrey, where it just goes inside itself again and again, and it seems like it's never going to end, which is precisely what all problems feel like if you don't have the image of yourself having succeeded. Finally, you emerge out of that sequence, and this is when, for my playthrough, the truth really started to come out. And what began to be revealed at this point was that this whole fantasy that you're in, this entire sequence that you've been going through, the Sweetheart's Castle, the Junkyard, the Deep Well, the Last Resort, Humphrey, all of these areas is something that you've been doing again and again and again. It just repeats.
There's a little river to swim through, and a voice starts telling you this information that finally reveals a little bit more, at least, about the nature of the dream world that you're in. It says, "You have come again to seek the truth. Each time your adventures may be disparate, but as your journey nears its end, it will always lead you back here, the truth. The truth is always the same. The path to the truth was once here, but it has been removed. It was moved to a lighthouse in a pier, then to a library banished deep underground, and after that to an old barn on a distant planet. And this time it will be in the heart of a vast forest. No matter how many times the path is concealed, the flower boy will always find it, and your dear sister Mari, she will always guide you to it."
The fact that it's saying that this loop is not repetitive, that it actually changes every time, makes it so that we are actually dealing with a progression of the character's swelling, fixation, and obsession, and psychosis. We're dealing with this character actually having lived, prolonged, and ongoing, and there's an actual arc. We're kind of jumping in media res to a story that has been long occurring. It suggests that the Basil and Mori characters, because Omori can't let them go, he is stuck always having them lead him back to what's true, the very thing that he's trying to ignore. Basil finds the truth and guides you to it, and presumably you could imagine in parentheses the words whether you like it or not. That's one of those ironies of trying to deal with pain, is in the process of trying to get rid of pain, you actually fixate on the thing that's causing you pain. It creates a cyclical knot wherein your exact continuous suffering over the thing is precisely because you're suffering over the thing. If we were in a traffic jam and I continuously complained about the traffic jam, my complaining is actually making the traffic jam a problem. Up until the point that I started to do that, it would have just been me in my car. This goes back to what we talked about before. The narrative that we place onto the thing has so much control over what is significantly harmful about it. There's this quote, "It is madness to resist what's happening." This very simple point that if the thing is happening and it's outside of your control, resistance to it is precisely what's making it have control over you. If you're late for something, resisting being late for that thing is now making it misery for you. Whereas if you just accepted, I'm late, and that's okay, I'm just late, you start to recognize how much your relationship to that thing is the story that you're telling about it. This character has something that they can't let go of, and that is the exact thing that's making them stuck in this place.
This idea of adapting to a situation by, first of all, accepting it is a hard thing to do correctly. There is a form of acceptance that is resignation. You are now not driven to solve problems because you've become addicted to accepting them so immediately and so completely that you're not rolling with the punches, you're just running away. It's the topic of this TEDx talk that came out recently by this stand-up comedian who's been gaining popularity and success recently named Drew Lynch. One of the peculiar things about Drew Lynch is that he has, as a result of a concussion, a speech impediment. He stutters. A lot of his jokes, especially early on, were about that speech impediment. He's a very funny guy. He's really excellent at crowd work. He's gotten particularly known for his ability to adapt on stage. He talks about how when you look at someone who tries to push a door when the sign says pull, you learn a lot about that person. They will either respond by getting mad at the door, or they will laugh at themselves for messing up. He uses that as an illustration of how being willing to take detours is actually how you get to a destination. In order to be destination oriented in any kind of reliable way, you have to also be willing to accept that things are not going to happen the way you expect them to, they're going to happen the way they happen.
It's doing exactly what Omori doesn't do. You have to actually accept the reality. Part of the reality is sacrifice and imperfect solutions all the time. You literally cannot get exactly what you want most of the time. Your happiness perhaps requires you to sacrifice the pursuit of happiness, or at least the pursuit of happiness as a goal in and of itself. There is this psychologist, Susan David. She talks about research on happiness where people, when they use happiness as an ultimate goal, what ends up happening is they create an expectation of happiness. And as soon as we create the expectation of happiness, along the route to that happiness, when things are imperfect, when things dip, when our emotions are remotely unhappy, the whole thing is destroyed because our literal goal was happiness. Whereas if we had the goal be something far more tangible, then we are far likelier to end up happy because it becomes a goal that is actually reasonably reachable. That might seem obvious, but I do think so much of our thinking is in terms of an emotional payoff, and the payoff has to be full. And so then that creates this constant grind toward that fullness, and is precisely the expectations that is the disappointment. The very definition of disappointment is contingent on you having made an expectation that was too high in comparison to what actually was there. This leads back to one of those old prayers that shows up in Christianity, and it's actually a very useful piece of advice. I'm not Christian at all, and neither are you, but it's still an interesting idea, and it's this prayer: grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. What that comedian was saying in the TEDx talk is such a great example. The door. You literally cannot push the door. It's literally out of your control. But what is in your control? Maybe have the thing that is in your control be the thing that you actually do something about. That's the quote, right? It is madness to resist what's happening. The addendum to that, because it's certainly easy to confuse that to just say be complacent with everything, would be to resist what's happening in the sense of what's already happened, the thing you literally can't do anything about. And that's the madness.
Even as hollow shells, they will continue to evolve, and each time they will grow wings and fly too close to the sun. It is their nature. They are the only ones who know, and one has carried it with her to her grave. Many times, your friends have met with an unfortunate fate. Your dear sister Mari with her bad knee, you could not bear for her to die again, so she was given the safety of a picnic blanket. Yet it is her nature to leave and to protect, and when she does, she will leave you again and be born anew with the undying soul that you have cursed her with. The souls assigned to your friends, they are fragile and must be protected, and so they must remain asleep. Yet the path to the truth is closer to your most precious room than ever before. Will you be able to bury it this time? Perhaps it is too late for you. You know of the keys to the other realm. They are different each time, but they will unlock the same door. The end of this journey will lead to suffering, but if you do not face this, you cannot continue. This form, though it has not shown its true self, is evil. You will not see that unless you fight it. When your intentions become hazy, they will transpire into this world like a thick fog. You will know when it happens. It has already happened before. At that time, return to where the truth was reborn, to the heart of the forest, and like each time before it, attempt to rewrite your fate. Will you be doomed to repeat this cycle over and over, or will you break it?
I have a direction that I'm very tempted to go, but I feel like it will immediately demonetize the video. We're finally getting pieces of truth, the very thing that we've been seeking this whole time. And we get it in an almost poetic form, which just like a lot of poetry, it's in the poetic form that the scarcity of every line is precisely what makes the density of its meaning rise to the top. There's this point where they say that you had condemned Mori and Basil's soul to just live on forever in this little fantasy space. This character, Omori, we know is someone who has slipped so heavily into this misery that their life has become rationally, not morally, I'm not going to make a moral argument, but perhaps reasonably not worth living. There is this question because we know that he is slipping into this fantasy because the fantasy is the only thing left that starts to become of value. Even if his life has become not worth living as a fault of his own, there is the fact of having slipped into it so deeply that you know it's too late for you to go back. And then it becomes the question of, would it be better for me to just be dead? Him condemning them to live forever reminds me of, I have a book on suicide called Nights Something. It's a book written by this psychologist, and she had a friend of hers commit suicide, and they had made a promise to each other that if they were ever going to reach the point of wanting to die, that they would tell each other so that they can just at least talk to each other one last time before it happens. When he ends his life, he doesn't call her and doesn't tell her, even though that's literally what they agreed on. He knew that he might become suicidal. He knew that this was a part of his life that he was building toward. And then he also knew, for whatever reason, that he shouldn't tell her because perhaps he figured she would stop him. There's this little thought experiment where you have to consider what is rational to do. Some people would argue that it is not rational to kill yourself because it doesn't make sense to say that you would be better off dead because you wouldn't exist if you're dead. So how can you say it would be better for you to be dead? Literally, you don't exist. The suicidal person, if they were philosophical at all, would make the point, well, that applies to death. How can you say that death is bad for me? Because I will not exist if I am dead. The only thing that could possibly be bad for me is living. And so if my life becomes not worth living, that is literally the definition of what is bad. So your argument against me killing myself becomes an argument against me living a bad life. So then the question is, at what point do you decide that a life is not worth living? Some philosophers would argue that, well, there is this view of the valuable container theory of life. Merely existing at all is valuable. And that anyone who says that you can quantify the value of life is treating the container of life as neutral. That's flawed, because living contains all of the possibility of flourishing and all of the possibility of suffering, but at least there's a you to suffer. But then the person who wants to commit suicide would point out, but you don't want to live as a blade of grass. You don't want to live as a slug. So it is not the container in and of itself that you value. When you say that life is valuable in and of itself, you are actually thinking of a specific kind of life. Personhood. What it's like to be a human. Probably the kind of life that you're living. If you wouldn't want to be a blade of grass or a tree or something that is immovable and yet living, well then how can you say that there is not a value within the container of life, wherein there is a level at which it is not worth living anymore? Therefore, the container is not valuable in and of itself. It has to be a neutral container. There has to be a degree of quality in life. But then there's this question again, okay, well, at what point is life not worth living? And then at that point, is it rational to kill yourself? And the worrying thing, if you think about it long enough, is there has to be a point where the rest of your life will be more miserable than the part that came before. It's not hard to imagine there being a point that there is no happiness anymore, where you perhaps have a chronic illness, where you are fully bedridden. And there's an even worse form of that, where you have an illness where you could not kill yourself if you wanted to. And at that point, you need to do it before, because you can't rely on someone else to kill you for you. It becomes an incentive that perhaps suicide is rational. You're imagining your life on a graph, and you're imagining there's some point my life is dipping, and I know that it's going to go underneath that point where it's not going to be worth living, and maybe I'm not going to be able to do it myself at that point. So I should do it even when I'm still happy. And then of course that becomes the argument for suicide. I think about that because with Mari and being condemned to immortality and him trying to hold her forever and trying to stay forever in this space, what you find very quickly is that life isn't valuable in and of itself. If he loops in this thing again and again, he is really suffering again and again, and the truth never stops coming back up again. Mari's kind of death never stops repeating, and the fact of whatever it is that he's trying to escape from never stops. He really is living a life not worth living. The reason I'm bringing all this up is if Omori can put himself in a situation where his life can be reasonably understood, at least from his point of view, as not worth living, then that puts the pressure on him to make sure not to allow that to be the case, for him to do something about this stagnancy that he's now locked himself into. The view of suicide as a choice only done by the delusional, by those who are far away, is a kind of veil that we put over ourselves to protect from the far more horrifying realization that perhaps it is possible to put yourself in a bad enough situation that the arguments against committing such an act suddenly become unpersuasive. And if you know that it's possible to put yourself in that kind of mindset, if you know that it's possible to make your life that miserable, then it becomes all the more necessary for you to do something about it. In some sense, you have no choice.
These days, I tend to think a lot about specifically moral philosophy, and I try to go as deep as I can with it. I think that requires being willing to have some very dark thoughts sometimes. One way in which I would agree with this insane thing is that not only is suicide in a way better than living by some standard, it is no different than living if you approach life from an entirely rational perspective. The idea of rationality is to achieve a goal, achieve what are literally called ends. It's appropriate that they are referred to as ends because I think if you focus only on achieving ends, you are basically aiming for death. You are aiming for the idea that, oh, I do not have to do anything anymore. This is my final adventure. It's this sweet release that rationality inherently pursues that I think can make life seem like it is no different from death and no better than death. To me, morality, the thread of morality that seems to be shared by almost all moral claims and norms, is the idea that one can waste an opportunity. That idea that there is not simply what we plan to happen, but what can happen. The idea that what can happen has some value outside of what we rationally want is the entire central idea of morality. Because morality is not about doing what is necessary, it's about doing more than what is necessary. Doing what is necessary is just simply to do what is rational, to do what is expected, to do what makes perfect sense, is not necessarily to achieve any moral virtue. To be actually morally virtuous by any standard. They always involve this idea that, yeah, I don't have to do this, but I should because there's an opportunity to. Weirdly, the best argument against suicide is a moral one, rather than some argument about, oh, rationally, it doesn't make sense to solve a temporary problem with a permanent solution, right? That's like the common rational argument against it. But like you just explained perfectly, it's a pretty insufficient counter because you could say the exact opposite and it would still make sense.
I want to back up what you're saying, actually. We need to back out of the terrible crusher we just parked our car into. Yeah, the important thing is that argument for why euthanasia might be sensible. Allowing a mercy killing, allowing someone to die, and not presuming that they're just completely irrational. That is a rational argument, but I did specify it's only a rational argument, right? It is good to remind oneself why morality is useful. and not why morality exists, because that's a separate argument and I don't want to defend that morality exists as something in the ether. But I do think it's far more defensible to make a comment on the usefulness of something being normative, of a claim applying generally, and you saying that there is an ought, there is a type of behavior that is generally beneficial. Now, one of the reasons it's useful to remind yourself of that particular use of morality is first to remind yourself that the moral claim has nothing to do with you. It's not about you and whatever rational conclusion you reach. What it is about, however, is what is generally applicable and generally useful. It is generally useful to not have your own death at your own hands be immediately available, because by the very nature of your limited capacity to know things, which is definitely a fact and rationally true, that you don't know as much as you think you know, and in fact there's far more that you don't know than what you do. Knowing that as a fact means that you might think you know that you're at that point in your life where it is not worth living, and you might be very wrong. You might merely be on a downward turn in your life, and it hasn't actually reached the point of not being worth living, or even if it has reached the point of being not worth living, it will only stay there temporarily, and then there is a huge uptick where you will suddenly have a life that is worth living. Now, we do find this in people who have traumatizing events in their life where they lose limbs or they go blind or something horrible happens to them. Psychologically, it is a life that is utterly miserable for them. And yet, if you continue to follow many of these people, generally, for whatever reason, our minds are very good at adapting to whatever situation we're in, wherein their level of happiness eventually tends to go back to where it was before. And so that general advice not to end your life is really just a general claim about the human psyche, which you are a part of, and to just remember that you might be presuming too much of a far-off view of your life when you're actually not at that point. You might presume that you can see the wholeness of it, and presume that what you're experiencing now will always be what it is now. This goes back to grief. We talked about this with grief. Grief is one of those things where it feels so acute, and precisely because it doesn't have a time frame, we presume it would just go on forever. Often the nature of rituals to just give us a point where we can psychologically let it go. And there are a lot of pains that are like that, where perhaps you haven't discovered the way in which you have a means of becoming more resilient by having gone through the pain. But that point at which you are resilient is not you in the way that you recognize. So you cannot be past facing, or you cannot look at your past self to determine how to get past this thing, because it is only a future version of you that actually gets past it, and you don't know what that is. There's a good moral reason not to want to die. You get all these answers, and they're cryptic, but then it thrusts you back into the white space, and you find out that you still have a job to do. That job is to get the final piece of the hangman puzzle. There's this puzzle that you've always been trying to solve the whole time you're playing the game. This little hangman game that's happening in the background, where you're finding literal keyboard pieces, computer keyboard. By finding those keys, you're filling out letters. What becomes very obvious at this point is the letters are supposed to be spelling out the words "Welcome to Black Space." It's a perfect example actually of performative text. The moment you see "Welcome to Black Space" is the moment you actually have access to black space. It's not a description of something separate from itself. Then you know you have to get this final key, which is the letter C, which of course puts you back in the fantasy. It's a strange sequence that the game forces you to collect this final letter, because everything had been building. We did the Humphrey the Whale sequence, and then we had all of these little poetic revelations, and then suddenly you just have to collect this last little piece. It felt really insignificant and oddly anticlimactic. So you go through the forest and you enter up high into the sky through this ladder, and you emerge in this tiny little square plot of foresty land. It's not a level at all. It really doubles down on this is an anticlimax, right? Everything had been going so high, and we are actively going to disappoint you back to back. You see the letter and it's sitting on a bench, and you could just pick it up and then walk right back down the ladder. And it's so perfectly anticlimactic because that's a ladder that you saw really early in the game. It's one of those things where you could see the full map, the headspace map, and you know that you're gonna have to go up to that space, so it seems like, oh, this is gonna be a big space. And then you finally get up there and it's just to get this little keyboard piece and it's just sitting on a bench. But then there's one other thing there. This is something that relates to the use of imagery, what the value of imagery is. When you only have one other thing in that space, you then have to do engaged reading of that thing. There's nothing else to look at. And so there's this kid who's just flying a kite in the northern side of that little space. Like all role-playing games, you have been doing combat sequence after combat sequence. You've been building up your abilities. You've become very strong. And you meet this kid and he's flying a kite and you want his kite so that you can fly it yourself. You can just get in a fight with this kid. It is entirely optional. Presumably, prior to the fight, it seems like, oh, this is going to be a big boss battle or something because this is the only thing in the space. It is actively not a challenge. You beat up this kid. And I'm only bringing it up because, again, it's the only other thing in the space. It feels like being the only thing in the space, it actively requesting interpretation. You had become overpowered at this point. You had become a bully. And he's trying to just resist as you continue to attack him, and then you just beat him up and you just take his kite. It's only interesting to me in the sense that you are a character who feels self-righteous in this journey that you're on. You feel like, okay, you have a right to go into all of these spaces and beat up all of these bad guys, and that has been the motif the whole time, is there's always a bad guy in these spaces, and you are the good guy, and you're the hero, and you're overcoming this challenge. Many of the characters being in this fantasy world are caricatures of types of bad guys. And then when you fight this kid, it's one of the few real moments of the fact of what it's like to think that you're in the right and to think that you can harm someone because you've been in the right before. So you've categorized yourself as the good person. And then the reality of that is you're just a bully. And you are now in this position where you could just beat up this kid because you had done all this work and you built up all this power and equipped all this stuff. And now you are just the bully on this little kid. It suggests that Omori sees himself as a bad person. He's become the villain that he had otherwise been fighting against this whole time. Perhaps this is his unconscious mind suggesting the kind of person that he thinks he is. He is not the hero at the end of the day. He builds up all of this power to merely utilize it for gratuitous ends, harming some innocent kid for the mere trifle of a kite. That's the outcome of the fantasy. Because he is trying so hard to avoid actually reaching the end point of revealing the truth, he instead is just fighting for fleeting, petty pleasures. So you get this letter C and you fill out the welcome to black space message. And then you have one final journey to go where you're going back to Basil's house. Along the way, the game has this small revelation. And it's one of those great game revelations like in Shadow of the Colossus or BioShock, where the game tries to remind you that there are consequences to your choices. That it's not just a character being written by a creator to have made a mistake. The game puts you in a position of just making the mistake yourself. Actually either being fooled or being forgetful. In this case, as you walk back to Basil's place, you pass by all of his flowers. And the key to the Basil character is he loved flowers. He literally had a wreath of flowers on his head. As you pass by all these flowers on the way to the house, as you initially had passed by those same flowers when you were first going to Basil's house, you were told that you could water them to keep them alive. And you know that these are Basil's flowers. You know that he cares about these things. In fact, you become obliged. You are the only one who can water them because you know that he's gone. And you got so sidetracked by the adventure itself, you almost selfishly pursued the fun of the adventure that you actually forgot to water his flowers. Your character is walking back and you're looking at the flowers and they're all dead, and you have this little moment of actual regret. I love it when games do this, where they make you feel the actual emotion. Instead of describing the character feeling it, you're just going through it. You have this feeling of, I made a mistake. I remember actually literally thinking to myself, oh, I should water these flowers. And I completely forgot because I got wrapped up in the adventure, which is exactly what the characters were doing. That's that second person element of video game storytelling where it's you doing the thing, so now you actually make the mistake. It's this wonderful build up to this final moment because you're going toward Basil's house and you're entering into this warped dark space where in my playthrough I finally saw Mori's coffin It doesn't say that she's dead, but you can infer that, okay, she's dead. But I'm in the fantasy world. I don't have any taste of the real world, so I thought the fictional Mori was dead. I didn't know anything beyond that. So for the Hikikomori run character, you're just seeing the visual of her lying in a kind of coffin, and then you enter the black space. This is where the game just becomes a series of warped imagery. In the white space, originally you had a white door that you could enter, and that's how you entered the cat room that then takes you to the fantasy space. Now you're in this black space with many doors, and every one that you enter is a kind of fantasy space, but it's not a comfortable one. Space is like a room of broken things, a smattering of colored sketch drawings, a sketchbook where everything's filled in red, a space of chalk figure outlines, and as you're going through, you're trying to find these little keys. You enter a black and white forested space with the words liar continuously reappearing again and again. There's one point where you enter a room with a butler and Miwo the cat, which is a cat that you see only like one other time. And you're asked if you want to cut open Miwo. And after a long set of desperate descriptions not to cut open Miwo, if you keep saying yes, I'll cut him because you think there's no other option, you of course do kill Miwo and it just dies. And then you're still stuck in the room. So the whole time you're thinking, oh, I have to do this. I have to kill this cat to escape this room. And so you end up just killing it. And again, it's the game doing that performative thing, which is making you actually feel real regret because you do kill the cat and that wasn't the solution. And it turns out this was another case where you should have just stabbed yourself. Because you didn't jump to putting the burden on yourself first, because you instead jumped to putting the burden on the cat, you just killed the cat. Such a great image at that final moment of you, again, just being so self-absorbed that you just don't account for the damage that you're actually doing to someone else. How perfect that this is the kind of loop that this character is wrapping themselves into. At some point you enter a dark space of trees and watermelons and basils there, and he asks in this space if you took care of his flowers. At some point you interact with him and he just bursts like one of the watermelons. What a great image for it to be a watermelon, because it is hard to differentiate between the color of the inside of a watermelon and the inside of a body. The black space is the place that you were building everything else to hide. The entire construction of the fantasy world is to avoid going into this black space. All of these rooms that you're entering are all of the ideas that you are trying to cut off from yourself. By entering them, you are just reliving these pieces, but of course they're scattered, like how all dreams are, just free associations of things that you're attached to or things from your daytime that aren't organized. In this black space, that's exactly what they are. Finally, you have enough keys where you don't have to continue entering more doors. There is a final red glowing door. After entering this door, you are in a snowy mountaintop. There are statues of religious figures. You interact with them and it says that they're judging you. You enter a kind of church. If anything speaks of judgment or symbolizes judgment, I think it's a church. You meet that stranger again. There's a stranger that you continuously meet who's like this abstracted dark figure. And the stranger says he won't let you leave him again or restart the cycle. He won't let you escape what you're trying to get away from. He says you've caused suffering to those you love. You won't face the truth. And you fight the stranger. And this is the true final battle. As you battle it, it's still talking to you. It says you left it behind. Every coping mechanism that you try, which the whole purpose of the game is you're building up all of these coping mechanisms, but none of them work against this thing. That suggests occurrences prior to the fantasy world, because of course the character you're playing in this fantasy world is aware of coping mechanisms. Clearly this character went to a psychologist at some point, or at least tried to solve their problem the traditional way, and they learned all of these ways of dealing with things. But this one thing that they're really trying to hide from themselves, none of those mechanisms work on. After this battle, you walk with Basil up a staircase of hand snakes, and at the top everyone is in bed sleeping. And I noticed that when you save in that space, the room is called neighbor's bedroom, and then the big yellow cat suggests that you sleep. And you sleep, and that was the end of my whole sequence, that whole chapter. That was the end of the 2 days left. This really long, dreamlike amalgamation of associations, clearly things that the character's trying to hide from themselves, but it's things that don't make sense in my run, in the sense that I don't have enough information to do anything with this.
By the time that you reach the entrance to the church, that is basically when our stories diverge again. You didn't feel like you got answers, because at the last second the answers were taken from you, but they were offered to people who went through the other route. In your version, you end up fighting Basil, which does not happen for me. There's no boss fight there. What I see is a realistic looking version of Basil is trapped in a tangle of black strands. He's near the church ceiling, just hanging there as if in a spider web. But then from behind Omori, another more translucent form of Basil promises that he and Sunny can face the truth here together. And then he walks up to the solid form of Basil and subsumes himself into it. Form of Basil that is the combination of those two. Says, "Will you ever forgive me, my best friend?" You follow Basil. As he's swallowed up into the darkness, you follow him into the hole. And in a room with a sliding door that looks like Sunny's house, Basil's snatched away by those red arm snakes. And he asks Omori to make them stop. Instead of helping, Omori slowly walks up to him and stabs him with a knife in the stomach. And then he casually just tramples over his corpse. You can hear his feet touching Basil as he tramples him. And he goes up the stairs of red arms forming under his feet, and he climbs onto a throne of large cupped hands, and he just stares ahead blankly and emotionlessly.
It's like your character is blaming themselves so badly for the crux of what the trauma is in their life that they've become a pariah in their own mind. They've become the bad thing. Everyone else tells you you're bad, so then you start to believe it yourself. And you see yourself as, maybe I am cold, maybe there's something wrong with me. It's one of the tough things about blame, especially when it comes to self-blame. We can be so much harder on ourselves for things that we would never be hard on others for. It's like if you knew someone and say someone passes away and you weren't nice to them the last time you talked to them. And you just beat yourself up over and over again about how terrible you were to that person. And you're just thinking, man, I just made their last days miserable. You can suffer that forever because you sort of define yourself as, I'm that kind of a person. I'm a terrible person. I need to hate myself now. But if your grandpa was mean to your grandma the day before she died, and then your grandma passed away, and then you found out that your grandpa was forcing himself to suffer over having done that, you would immediately tell himself to forgive himself, that it's understandable, that of course you didn't know that she was going to die. Of course it doesn't mean you're a bad person because none of your choices were made for the purpose of harming her. It was for the purpose of the moment. Maybe you were angry at her justifiably over something small, and perhaps you over-exaggerated your anger a little bit, and that is a perfectly fallible thing for a human being to do, and of course you should forgive yourself. We know that we could give that advice to someone else, but when it comes to ourselves, we are so unfriendly to ourselves. We don't treat ourselves the way we would someone we liked. We seem to be prone toward weakness and victimhood. We are inclined to believe that we are our worst traits and we are as weak as we're afraid of. All of the fears that we have about ourselves must be true because otherwise why would we think them? Instead of the alternative explanation, which is they're only fears precisely because you're the person inclined against those things. Instead, just by having those fears, we think, no, that must be a deeper truth about us. We become cruel to ourselves in a way that we wouldn't be toward others. That whole sequence just reminds me of that. It just feels like this Omori character is in the deepest recesses of his subconscious, feeling like the guilt is justified. That he's not just guilty, he's not just blameworthy, but it is all right to do so. We know that this is in the deep recess, the thing he was trying to hide. And so the thing he's trying to hide from himself is actually thinking he did do something wrong. And to think to himself that he did something wrong is to then, for him, admit that he must be wrong. There is something identified with him that he is flawed, that he is a terrible person. And that is so hard to face and to deal with. Hence, the entirety of the fantasy that we've been traipsing throughout the whole game was him just trying to escape and say like, no, like I could have done otherwise. There's all these other things I could have done. Mori could have been safe. My friends, I could have been with all of them. I could have had adventures. I could have been all of these other things. But the reality is, not only is he not those things and could not have done those things, but he believes that he is truly incapable of being good and doing well. Maybe it's his fault. There's something I'm circling around that I kind of don't want to talk about, but there's an experience in my life that I guess other people would call traumatic. But I do remember the thing that sucked about it, the thing that I really didn't like, the thing that made it something that I suffered over was, for a long time, the way people talked about the thing was in terms of me being a victim. And my memory of the thing was the parts of it that were my choice. Because people wouldn't bring up the parts of it that were my choice, it made it feel like I was hiding from them the truth. And because they talked about it almost like the very definition of the trauma was a thing where you're only a victim, it made it feel like, oh, that must mean I'm actually the perpetrator. I actually did something really wrong and I'm just tricking everyone to thinking that I'm the victim. And the truth is I'm not. It's funny because all of that is just a story. And again, it goes to this thing about like, how are you framing the narrative of the events that are happening to you? The thing that you discover about actually going through a traumatic experience is how much it isn't the one that's being spoken about. The one that people speak about is the one that fits very nicely into moral categories because they're trying to teach you a lesson about it. They're not actually trying to talk about the thing in the same way that we can't talk about whether it's okay to die. It's one of those things where the reality of the trauma is actually a gain if you understand it as such, because what you are gaining is something deeply true and complicated about something that if you hadn't had the experience, you wouldn't know. Once you have the experience, you can decide to make yourself suffer and blame yourself again and again. Like Omori is just blaming himself for whatever horrible thing he had done or been involved in. But the reality is what you just learned is something that was true, and you can actually connect to all these other people who've had similar experiences, and you're not alone. You only think you're alone because you're connecting to people who haven't had the experience, and so they speak about it in platitudes and flat versions of the thing.
You mentioned that people have almost this inclination to place themselves into this category as soon as they realize that they are to blame for something. I do think that is a very peculiar thing that almost everybody does, and it feels like it has to result largely from this cognitive dissonance that happens when especially a loved one puts a label on you. A loved one interprets something that happens to you or happens as a result of your decisions and says, well, if you did this, then that means you are this. Because you trust this person, the fact that that is a completely unfair way of representing how human beings actually work doesn't register as strongly as the fact that this is apparently how I'm supposed to view myself. I'm supposed to view myself as either pure or tainted by the nature of how I morally rank my actions. If I do something that has a negative consequence, that means something about me, as opposed to the more intuitive, kind of obvious interpretation, which is that if something bad happens, that's because the world is complicated. There are more ways to make mistakes than to succeed.
This is actually one of the harms of moral thinking. Moralistic thinking causes you to need to categorize. That's the very nature of morals, is you're taking a thing that exists as a fact in the world and you're prescribing values on top of it, adding a description to it that then carries weight. The issue with that is it makes the world far more slotted and far less along a vast spectrum of complicated in-betweens. It actually is a removal of the in-betweens. It's a removal of that liminal space. By doing so, you are sacrificing the truth, because the truth is everything is the spaces in between. The divide is always mental. The harm comes in this case because if it's necessary in order to be a competent moral thinker to think that there must be good in the world and that there must be good people, and therefore there must be bad in the world and there must be bad people, anything that even gets remotely close to the bad category is sucked into the category fully because there are no gradients between. And that's precisely one of the ways in which it's always important to be careful about morality, because it is a tool that can be used for good and for harm. If you wanted to say, well, how can you say morality is bad? I'm not saying morality is bad. I'm only saying that it's neutral. I'm actually making the longer, more elaborate claim that how could you say morality is good, because that would be morality declaring itself good. That would be circular. It has to be neutral. In the same way you can't say it's bad. Because it is neutral, it can be used for harm. And in fact, perhaps there is something necessary about the mere formulation of morality that guarantees certain harms. It is always up to you whether that is worthy of keeping or not. Sometimes the harms might outweigh the benefits, and that's a much bigger conversation to have. But one of the ways in which it is harmful is it creates this thing of you attach yourself to the category, and once the category is there, that sticks. We are so inclined to have it be real. And there's a lot of suffering, so much suffering, in thinking that the person who did the bad thing is different from you. I had the good fortune of growing up around people who did terrible things, and growing up around people who also grew up separate from me to do terrible things. And it's nice to know that I was that close to being that terrible person, that there wasn't really anything different other than happenstance. And it's important to recognize that so that you don't have such a thick divide between yourself and whatever bad thing you want to categorize. The last departure between us is this ending. This is sort of what this whole video has been leading up to, is the choice that you and I made at the very beginning of this game to either open the door or not, completely split our timelines in terms of what's going to happen to these characters. I anticipated that my timeline was going to be focused on the fantasy world. I did not quite anticipate how much of an anticlimax the ending would actually be. I think it'll be worth considering what purpose rests behind the choice to have the ending be this way. What kind of meaning can be gleaned out of it, and or significance from the kind of feeling that this ending leaves you with. I certainly had a strong feeling in spite of the barren impetus for that feeling. We reach the chapter title card of One Day Left. As is most often the case when transitioning between the chapters, my character wakes up as Sunny in his home. The fact of what these days were building up to finally is known, and that is that it is moving day. So all of these days have been counting down to this character finally leaving their home and going somewhere else. That to me already feels anticlimactic, in the sense that it feels like, well, moving, yeah, is stressful. Moving can be painful. You're leaving behind so many people that you know. You're going into a new space. You have to adapt. That can be very scary. But it certainly doesn't feel at the level of what this game was presenting to me emotionally the whole time. The whole time it was giving me the sense that I was counting down towards something truly horrifying. And the only reveal that I was given was, okay, you're moving out. There's this final sequence, and that is waking up as Sunny in his room. Moving day is tomorrow, and so he has to organize his stuff into either boxes to take with him or into the trash. And this is when the game becomes as literal as possible in terms of what its symbolism was. There's been all of this strong suggestion, and you and I have made this clear that we believe this to be the case, that so much of his fantasy is built out of real-world objects and things, that he was incorporating whatever it is that he knows in his day-to-day life and then inputting them into this fantasy world as a kind of comfort through full control. He got to be the celestial dictator of his mind. When you're organizing these items into these boxes or into the trash, most of the items are directly related to things that you find in the world. For instance, there is a Captain Spaceboy action figure. One of the earliest bosses in the game that you fight off, well, that character is just an action figure. There is a Humphrey book, so the Humphrey the Whale at the very end, we get to see exactly where that even the name Humphrey comes from. It's a literal children's book, a little picture book. They have The Kid and His Kite, another book. That kid and kite that we fought at the end that became a kind of testament to the hubris that builds up through success and the ways in which we can sometimes use that to harm others while feeling superior at the same time. That character at the edge of that final location was just a character in one of his books. We have the Sweetheart doll. So Space Cowboy had an action figure, Sweetheart has a doll. Again, these characters are not wholly made up in the mind of this child. It's all there in his room, and he's putting them away, and you're deciding what to keep and not. And again, the only significance of this moment is it's this point in the game is just making as explicit as possible. The world that you're experiencing was through his eyes, through his feelings and what it is that he attaches himself to. That is so much of the kind of interpretation that you, the player, should be doing, is thinking in terms of what does this mean for him? Why is he putting these pieces in the places that he's putting them? It's one thing to use these objects, but it is significant how those objects are narrated together by this character in his mind. That final sequence gives you that little push of you're on the right track if you're at least thinking that way. For me, that was the nearest to satisfaction I got, because other than that, it was very unsatisfying. I continued to walk around the house. At this point, I am searching for answers, because I know this is the end of the game, and I'm thinking, okay, finally I'm gonna get everything I want. And as I'm walking around the house, there's a ghostly hovering figure floating alongside me, and we've seen this figure many times before. And no matter how long I wander around the house, and I did wander for a while, and I tried to interact with everything, I was fairly restricted in terms of what I was able to do. I wasn't able to go outside, for instance. At some point, it becomes obvious that this is a mirror of white space, in the sense that it is a purposeless space where this character has nothing to do other than self-destruction. And so you open the menu and you have the option to, and I only know to look for this because they trained me in the white space, you have the option to stab yourself. I did find one other option, which is to fall asleep. But the way I just framed it, of you have the option to stab yourself, it really is only the option to stab yourself, and I'll explain why. If you choose to stab yourself the moment you notice that, you will die as you would expect. You stab yourself, except this time you're not in the white space, so you're not stabbing a figment of yourself. You're not stabbing some identifier that you projected onto a screen. You're actually stabbing your body, and then the credits roll, and all you hear is the phone ringing. Presumably, your mother finally came by, maybe knocked on the door a few times, maybe started banging on the door, maybe started yelling, and she's calling to see why is the door not opening. Or she's calling before she arrives. Whatever it is, the phone is just ringing and ringing and ringing, and the credits are rolling, and that's it. And I got no other answers than that. I just have the story that we knew this always was, of a kid who could not face the pain of something and decided to end his own life. And that's it. There was a false option. There is the option to actually go to bed. Now this is what you always do. You eventually go back to sleep, and then Omori pulls you out of the abyss that you're sunk into. In this case, if you choose to go back to sleep, you will end up back in white space. And this time it's slightly different. If you open the laptop, there's a blue background with piano and books. And you can walk out through the door that you find in the center of the white room, and you can enter into the space with the cat looking down. And it's the beginning of the game again. This is like a new game plus. You have all of the stats and all of the equipment and even the full party that you had before, except now you're at the beginning of the game. And if you go further into this fantasy space, you go to the picnic in the middle of the playground, and you get to look through Basil's photographs of all the friends. Well, this time when you look through the photographs, you'll actually be able to see new photographs. There are suggestive differences. And there's a lot more. Now you have freedom to explore this fantasy space. That seems to be my major reward. I dove so deep into this fantasy, I never let up. I never went outside. My reward is a predictable consequence of having done so. I didn't allow myself any other respite or any other challenge. And so I am now stuck in the challenge of the fantasy. I'm stuck in this world. And I can go to new places in this fantasy world. They fit in line with it being a continuation of just this kid's fantasy of things. You're not really getting more information about the world as it actually is, about the real world. You're just getting more of his fiction. And you know that his fiction is a fiction. To me, this feels like a false choice because you're actively choosing not to have the game end. You're actively choosing not to be satisfied with any kind of finality. It's this point that we brought up earlier about the nature of grief, how the nature of almost any emotion, it doesn't have an end point. It just can go on and on and on. I think when you decide to enter back into this fantasy, that is the choice you're making, is to not allow for an end point, to just keep the fantasy going on and on and on. But then at any point, you can go back to the white room and you can stab yourself, and you will go back into the house. And then seemingly there's one more thing that you can do. You can leave the house, and in my playthrough, for the first time, I am seeing the outside world, but I'm only seeing it in the walk to get to the moving truck. You go into the truck, and it pulls out and it drives away, and then the credits scroll. You can faintly hear an ambulance. That could mean any number of things. Again, it is so deadening, the feeling of ambiguity that's being given by this ending. Because the ambulance could be, were you in a car accident, or did you kill yourself? Based on the consistency of tone and theme here, I'm assuming that wherever you move to, Sonny decided to do what you could have done a little bit sooner, and that was just to end his own life. The feeling I had with this ending was initially disappointment. I think you have to be kind of disappointed. It was as anticlimactic as possible. There is a lot of anticlimactic works out there. Ambiguity, especially in postmodernism, where they're always playing with the form that you're reading. They're playing with breaking the fourth wall, with bringing the reader in and making them sort of aware, self-conscious about the fantasy that they're trying to construct. Anticlimax is a major part of that. It's sort of setting up this idea that, oh, you were expecting all of this to build up to something, but of course, it's all made up anyway. What is the satisfaction that you're craving in this climax to the story when the story isn't real? I just made it up. Purposeless. I felt like the ending for me performed what it was describing. It was describing this kid whose life felt deadened, dragged down. his source of progress was all fictional. There's something inherently trivial to that because every problem that is shown in that fantasy world has to be worthless in a sense, knowing to yourself that none of it is real. And so none of it really matters. And that ending really gave me that sense of none of this mattered. I did all of this stuff. I was building and building. As soon as I was collecting the toys in the toy box and just putting them in their different places, it was very obviously all of that. You're not going to get an explanation for it. All you're going to get is, oh, it was just the toys. It was just the stuff in his head. There, that's your answer. And that is such a disappointing answer. It's like why when you have a twisting and turning knot of a plot in a television series, if your only answer to that really complicated box of mystery that you've set up, if your answer is just to say, oh, well, they were all dreaming the whole time. Well, it's disappointing because all you've done is remind the viewer of what they had spent all their time suspending their disbelief to avoid, which is the fact of course it's all made up, but you were supposed to give me something more. What this story did is say, it's all made up and it's all made up. It was so heavily anticlimactic. After I gave it a few minutes, I find myself now really liking that ending, strictly because there's a courage to the slap in the face that it gave me. It really fully committed to making me have consequence to what I did. I decided not to go out. I chose this path to have the fantasy be my world. And so if I had any inkling of caring about the true ending or caring about what is true in the world, well, I dug my grave and now I have to rest in it. I did this. I decided to stay in the fantasy world. It's kind of nice to have a game really stick to its guns, really have the consequences matter, and that be it.
From my perspective, knowing that you were going to have this completely different ending, and knowing that I found my ending so full of thought-provoking elements just laid out in a row and presented in such an ingenious formation to me. Like, I loved the ending. And knowing how much I loved the ending, when I compare that to yours, I felt bad for you. I wished that there was some way that you could just shunt the train at the last second, just see what the actual meaning of certain aspects of the story were supposed to be. I do also understand that is not in there for no reason. It perfectly fits into the real consequences of that choice that you make at the beginning. It is the natural conclusion of that. I don't know your exact experience with this. I think I have my guesses a little bit, but I know that for me, I've had streaks in my life of feeling very nihilistic, trying desperately to understand why I should care about certain things. Because I have such a history of feeling that way, I do dread the possibility of being forced back into that mindset by a story. While I don't view stories necessarily as escapist, I want them to have more meaning than what I necessarily see sometimes in the real world. I want them to be less arbitrary. I want most stories to make an argument for a purpose. Even if that argument is not always entirely something I agree with, I want that statement to be made by the end. If a story won't do that, and if a story instead is simply a mirror showing how pointless everything really is, it feels like reinforcing something that doesn't need any of your help. The world can feel plenty meaningless without us having to be long-winded explaining how meaningless it is. That disappointment is something that I don't want to experience generally, and I feel bad for knowing that you had to go through that. But again, like anything, even a presentation of a meaningless ending can itself have meaning. I'm glad you saw that.
Perhaps that points to why I ended up feeling comfortable with the ending. I have that inclination that you do too, toward nihilism, or toward at least the most basic view that meaning is not inherent to anything per se, that meaning must be constructed, and so if you think through that line of reasoning far enough, it must be at least to some extent arbitrary, or at least locally dependent. It's not objectively the case that something has meaning. Perhaps my comfort comes with the fact that this ending is almost forcing the player to have that feeling of distance from purpose, from satisfaction, from story. And by giving that distance, that is a very uncomfortable feeling, especially if it's your first time having that feeling of utter spread far from anything to hold. I think that ending gives that kind of discomfort of not telling you what to think or what to feel in a way that's final. It really is telling you that, yes, this was all arbitrary. Whatever you figured out, or at least believe you figured out, we're not going to tell you if you're correct. And so you are just going to be left adrift. But that to me is also very comfortable, because I do think that, and it's okay if you disagree, you the listener, but I do think that at bottom that is a very uncomfortable truth about a lot of things, is that there are certain things that we really will never have an answer for, and there are certain things that really are arbitrary, and there are certain things that we assert as true for emotional reasons, not for ontological reasons, in terms of what actually is the case. When people hear nihilism, they think, oh, this person doesn't believe in anything, therefore they must be destructive in some sense. It's that sort of Nietzschean view, they must be an Ubermensch who just wants to tear down weakness and dominate the world. Or it's someone who is now deadened so much that they just have no purpose to do anything. Why wake up in the morning? How can you like anything if you're a nihilist? That perception or that response is a misunderstanding of the options at play when you reach the conclusion of being nihilistic. There's what's called positive nihilism, and this nihilism is the choice that follows from the realization that there is no meaning to anything. And it's the person who decides, I'm not going to then think there's no point in doing anything. I'm not going to then be defeated by that thought. I'm going to instead be quite liberated by that thought. If there is no meaning to anything, then I have full control over meaning. I have full control over what matters. It is a blank slate which puts me in charge over every facet of what matters to me in my life. And that is how I experience nihilistic thinking, or at least how I have for many years now. I do find comfort in the fact that it's nice when a game is okay with taking a very uncomfortable stance of meaninglessness and letting that drag out.
So the last image we ended on in my playthrough was that moment after you reach the church, walk up a bridge of hands onto a throne of hands, and then stare blankly into the middle distance. After this, Sonny wakes up in the middle of the night and he hears the faint sound of a piano. Downstairs there's a room containing a piano. In it he finds Mari's ghost and she's sitting there playing it. And she says, "You know, waltzes were always my favorite. That's why I chose this song for our last recital. But you always hated it, didn't you? How I'd locked myself away on the piano, all that practicing, playing the same song over and over. When you first picked up your violin, you were so eager to play with me. But keeping up with something isn't so easy. Maybe I pushed you too hard. I'm sorry, I just wanted it to be perfect. We never did get to play that last recital. Did you want to play it with me now?" And before Sonny can answer, Hiro barges in. He says that he heard music, and then he realizes that, Sonny must miss Mari a lot, and he says he still thinks about her every day and doesn't understand why she chose to leave the way she did. And then Sonny goes back to his room to sleep.
That scene adds an extra tinge of layers to the grief, because not only is it the loss of his sister, there was an added waste to her loss. Precisely because she was so devoted to something that required so much time and repetition, there may have been this sense from Sonny's point of view that, well, whatever time we are not spending together will be made up for in some future state. And so when she passes, not only is she gone, but so is the opportunity to make up for all that time not spent with one another. And that is an upending of a version of your life, a version of yourself. If you anticipate so much of your future in relation to this other person, and that person passes, well then that you in that future is now dead too. Whatever that could have been is now also dissipated.
This was probably one of the first more concrete hints that Mari had been found to commit suicide, that this was actually the cause of her death. They were always vague about it. They're going to continue to be vague about it a little while longer. It clarifies a little bit of just the guilt that everybody else feels in the aftermath. Often, I think, people can wonder if somehow it's their fault. Imagine scenarios where they saved someone's life by reaching out in some perfect way. This only scratches the surface on how real and sad and unfortunate this story really is. So on the last day, Sonny wakes up in his house, alone as usual. Hiro comes up and he announces that breakfast is ready. So downstairs they're eating breakfast. There's a knock on the door, and it's Aubrey's friend. She's worried Aubrey's not coming out of her house today, no matter how much they gather around and try to get her out. But Kel says, well, there's no need to help Aubrey because she's been so mean to them lately, especially after pushing Basil into the lake the day before. Hiro says he still cares about Aubrey, though. She says that she probably cares too, despite her recent attitude. They find Aubrey in her house. She was hiding away in her bedroom. Immediately, she's angry to see all of them. But Hiro says, they're just checking on her. They want to know how she's feeling. And he also wants to hear from her what happened at the lake yesterday. Kel then starts berating her for pushing Basil. She starts deflecting by saying, none of this is Kel's business. But he says, well, it is my business because all of you were once my best friends. Hiro hears this stereotypically shallow argument between Cal and Aubrey, and he ignores it, walks over to the photos on the wall. These photos on the wall are some of the last missing photos from Basil's photo album. These are the ones depicting Mari. Some of them toward the end do seem to have some significant insight. She is shown practicing at her piano for a recital, which would be her and Sunny's first performance together. In the next photo, Basil says that she's camera shy after making one small mistake, but he's sure nobody will even notice. In the photo after that, Sunny started rehearsing on his violin too, although it took some begging from Mari. There seems to just be one last missing photo to complete the album. After they've all looked through these photos together, Aubrey apologizes for some of the hostility she's had. Kel apologizes too. They all feel more hopeful, and Hiro suggests a group hug like old times, but the others would rather not, so they skip it. And as they leave Aubrey's house, she formally joins the party of her 3 old friends, and now they are a party of 4 once again in the pause menu.
You mentioned that the pause menu changed, so they're all together. One change that happened prior to the actual final moments when my character was about to move was the main menu kept oscillating between Sunny and Omori. Seems like the borders between that character. Sunny was really fully becoming Omori, and Omori was Sunny, and they were just sort of becoming one another. They're just combining together. It's funny, these little fourth wall breaks, these little UI elements where they're trying to connect back to the story in ways that are in line with how the story is presented at the same time. The form of the story is directly relating to what is being told in the story. And that is, of course, so much of how the game presents itself throughout. There's a consistency there because the game is always playing with UI. If you remember when you're walking around the fantasy world, everything looks like a 16-bit video game, a top-down RPG. But then along the margins, you always have those little childlike drawings, like a reminder of childhood. And it's like right outside the frame is a new way of seeing things, which is, of course, always what the nature of these traumas that persist, these things that don't die off in our psyche. It's because the frame that we chose to have in the center is of one thing, and we can sometimes forget that it is a frame and that we do have a choice. Perhaps that's the power of nihilism too, is recognizing when you have a choice can be liberating if you're not too scared of the fact of having to actually be responsible for it. The UI is being playful right there before the end, making you think again about the frame at which you're even experiencing the game that you're playing. And so you had a little bit of that too in your final moment.
So now that they're all together, they try to pay Basil a visit at his house. They find out from his caretaker he's off visiting his grandmother in the hospital today. And they all promise to see him when he gets back from the hospital. And they arrive at his house around sunset, finding that apparently he wouldn't say anything when he first arrived home, and he locked himself in his room immediately. He won't respond to anyone, even his friends, as they knock on the door. So the 4 of them are now determined to stay at Basil's house for the night to be there for him when he needs them. So they take the living room for themselves and they rest in sleeping bags. There's a black screen that appears when Sunny goes to sleep, and it says, "Don't worry, everything is going to be okay. Will you forgive me, my best friend?" These are Basil's thoughts, as we then see him sitting alone in the darkness, surrounded by bright white eyes of something. And then the word please appears, his one last word as he's consumed by his dark surrounding. And then Sunny opens his eyes in white space, looking terrified, as if suddenly Basil's situation is finally getting to him. Sunny walks up and destroys the black light bulb, bringing darkness to the white space and immediately starting a battle with the one-eyed something. Deeper and deeper it drags him into the shadows, changing shape each time he goes deeper. Eventually something appears as a hanging girl swaying in the wind. After a long effort to calm down, Sunny learns to overcome. He picks up the light bulb from the ground. It's not black anymore. He then is warped away to a path with trees and a sequence of metal gates in front of him. And there are photos from his repressed memories all strewn along this path. They're presented in black and white, unlike the real world's photographs. The first Polaroid depicts a tree from a low point of view. Sunny then approaches Basil at the end of the path before entering the tree with a hole in it. Before he can enter, Basil asks him for forgiveness one last time. So the inside of the tree is Sunny's house, dark at nighttime. He explores it for the photos that all reveal his repressed memories. They come in a random order, they don't seem to tell a story coherently at first. The home's main staircase is extremely long, like it has been a few times before. And Sunny ends up in Mari's bedroom. She's lying on her bed and she's not breathing. And Basil is there as well, saying, "Sunny, don't worry, everything is going to be okay." The increasingly menacing environment leads up to a path to a tree with a hanging noose. It's sort of like the black space at this point. It's kind of this chaotic, menacing atmosphere everywhere. And then the photos form a complete timeline.
It feels to me that in your version of the story, you're getting all the answers that you could want, but they're unsatisfying in a different way because they really are sad. It leaves you understanding the pain where it's coming from, but it's also making it so that the pain is maybe too relatable. It really feels heavy. I need to know where it's going.
I think I agree that at this point, the reality of what's making them so sad is so universally relatable that it creates this sense that one often, I think, has to feel when you find out that somebody else is grieving, which is that you have to acknowledge that they are more sad than you can probably currently imagine, and that you have no business trying to imagine it. There's this sort of detachment that you automatically go into, I think, when you think like, oh, okay, so somebody has gone through something incredibly sad that has nothing to do with them. It just happened in their life. These things happen. All we can do is wait and provide them some completely insufficient comfort in the meantime. So it seems like that's what this story is about. It surprises me so much, though, with what it's actually about. It's sad in a way that brought me back into it again, because it wasn't just a generic sadness about something that has nothing to do with you. It is literally something that I forgot could happen. If you asked me to list the whole Rolodex of what are the tragedies that befall human beings, I would have forgotten that this is one of the things that can happen to a person. So here's the final order of all of these black and white photos that are, of course, not real photos. They just represent the repressed memories that are coming back to them. The first photo is kind of a blurry look at the side of a wall next to a curtain, almost peeking around a wall. The next photo shows what is behind that area peeking around the wall, which is a broken violin at the bottom of a staircase. At the top of the staircase, Mari is seen yelling at Sunny. The reason it seems like she's yelling at him is because he has this dejected look looking at his feet while she stands over him. And then there's the image of her basically getting in his way as he tries to leave to go down the stairs. Then there's her falling down the stairs. Then there's a photo of her lying at the bottom of the stairs next to the broken violin. There's Sunny hesitantly walking down the stairs. Then there's a picture of her being pulled over off of her side to see her face. Then there's a photo of her being dragged up by Sunny as well as another person, the other person who also witnessed this. They continue dragging her up the stairs to a room. They put her on the bed. There's a photo of Sunny next to her bed on his knees, probably crying next to her. And there's a photo of just looking at somebody's hands, like somebody looking at their own hands. Then there's another photo of Sunny curled up next to her bed with his arms over his head. Then there's a photo of Sunny having his arms jostled by the other person. And then there's a photo of them dragging her again and going through these sliding doors. And in the reflection of the sliding doors, you can see Basil's face. Then there's a picture of a tree. There's another picture of the tree from below. There's a picture of the base of the tree with a rope next to it. A picture of hands tying a knot in the rope. A picture of her hanging feet. A picture from the distance of her hanging from the noose. And then a picture of her eye peeking through her hair. That warps into the image of something.
Tell me if I got this wrong in terms of my understanding. She fell down the stairs while scolding Sunny, presumably because he wasn't doing well enough while playing the violin. Did Basil help Sunny make it look like she committed suicide, even though she died accidentally? So Sunny's grief, the whole thing that he's dealing with, is that he lied to everyone. He told everyone that she committed suicide. And it was really because he didn't want to take the responsibility or the blame for having actually killed her, even though it was an accident. It's wild. Both Sunny and Basil both were going through grief, but a different grief than everyone else. So it's like doubly removed. It's not what I expected at all. And they got away with it and she was buried and everyone thinks that she committed suicide.
The game doesn't go into this explicitly after that, but there is that moment where you fall into a hole and you can see that scene where his dad is cutting down a tree and saying, "You are not my son." At the end of the day, they're not master criminals. They panicked and they tried to hide this thing. It was probably incredibly obvious that she did not actually kill herself once the parents got home. So they had to deal not just with lying, but with realizing just the pointlessness of it. And also, she probably wasn't really dead. They probably killed her by hanging her. They would have no way as children of really checking.
So the father probably found out. He probably figured it out. Is that why the father's gone?
He reacted one of the ways that someone might react to finding out that their son killed their daughter, and he fully saw his son as a murderer and also a liar on top of that, and just stepped out of the picture. Doesn't seem like his mom did, though.
That makes the moving day so much more significant. The thing that I said in my playthrough felt completely insignificant, almost a drab outcome of, oh, that's the thing he was dreading was moving. And now it seems more clear that he was dreading it because maybe that put such a strong finality to what he had done. And it also takes him away from any kind of physical semblance of her, of Mari. Maybe part of the guilt is getting away from it and feeling like you get away scot-free. Because he is not a monster, because it is actually an accident and actually just what he thought was the best thing he could do, best not morally, but best in terms of himself, best selfishly. And then to just get away, to have to move, puts you in a position of feeling like, well, but I deserve punishment. This kid wants to feel, I am a bad person and I deserve the consequences of that, and I'm not getting that, and I'm hurting in such a way that I can't relate to anyone. That's one of the worst things about this reveal that you're saying is because Sunny and Basil are lying to everyone. It's precisely one of the consequences of lying that doesn't get spoken of. There's always this separation between, oh, there's bad lies and there's good lies, right? There's white lies, and these are ones where you're doing it for the greater good of something. But even white lies, really every lie, has the property of separation from the person you are lying to. To one extent, you are separating the person from the reality. You're robbing them of the truth of something. But to the other extent, you're separating yourself from them because then you know something that they don't, and you can't talk to them about it. It's one of the worst things about lying to someone you're in a relationship with. Even if you get away with it day after day after day, what you're doing is you're removing the story that has you entwined as an actual coherent unit, as an actual team together. If you make it so that the relationship continuing is on the basis of you lying to that person, of you separating yourself from that person, you've made it so that the relationship is purely using the person as a means to your selfish end of your satisfaction. You've crossed out certain degrees of relationship. So Sunny and Basil have completely X'd connection with all those around them. And they are dealing with something painful, so painful that connection becomes one of the few ways that you can get out of it. This is one of those pits of despair that anyone dealing with guilt or repression of a mistake, what they deal with, they are dealing with being sucked into a kind of cyclical psychological torture of feeling like it's my fault, it's my fault, it's my fault, because you're the one blaming yourself. And it really is only someone else that can pull you out of that. But because Sunny and Basil have put themselves in the position of not even being able to actually say what is hurting them so badly, having the thing that everyone's reassuring them about be the wrong thing, be the false thing, now they're even deeper away from everyone else. They're even deeper away from the only anchor that you have left to get back to connection with the rest of the world. You're now just stuck in your abyss. And that is what the game is showing again and again, this character being pulled down deep into that deep well of being stuck. And that is the progress we've been making in this fantasy world, is just being consumed by your despair. And in this case, it is consuming because you have no tether to anyone else. You've cut your own line from other people. That's a uniquely bad pain that this story sets up. If it was just grief, you always have that sense of, well, everyone else is grieving with you. There's that unity there. This particular pain completely takes away that opportunity and adds the additional pain of being self-ostracized or being fully adrift. You're not just alone in your suffering, you're actively alone even in your truth, even in what's actually there. Sunny and Basil are stuck playing a long con against people they don't want to con, against people that they wish that they could be with and connect with.
Even though this is a huge twist that we couldn't have expected, it only makes the feeling worse. It does not change the fundamental feeling that we thought this character was going through. After the reveal, Sunny wakes up in the middle of the night. He's in Basil's house with all of his friends, sleeping next to him in sleeping bags. And he goes up to Basil's bedroom to save him. You're given the option, do you want to save Basil? And when you go inside, Basil sees you. He's immediately eager to talk some more about the day that Mari fell down the stairs. He's stammering to Sunny about how Sunny couldn't have done it because a good person wouldn't do that. He's upset about Sunny moving away and leaving them all alone again. He seems angry about it. And he says, there's something behind you. And when you look behind you, there is the specter of something right next to you. And then he doesn't allow Sunny to leave as he attempts to leave the room. He just desperately wants to save Sunny from something that ruined his photos and killed Mari. This also reveals that Basil was not the one to black out the photos, it was Sunny. So they have a fight, like an actual turn-based battle. Sunny is getting increasingly stressed out until Basil attacks Sunny's right eye, seemingly gouging it out or damaging it. Then they both faint. So Sunny goes back into dreams again, and he hears a voice telling him that, the acknowledgement of the truth has come at a great cost, but that it is not too late for redemption. He reconciles with Basil in the dream. He's in the dream version of his neighborhood around twilight. And then after reconciling with Basil, he enters his house again, looking for the toy box. Suddenly, there's a door that was never visible before walking through his house. This door is a closet containing the toy box. And inside the toy box, there's the broken violin, and it still has entangled black hair in it, as well as blood, and blood-stained sheet music. He is transported to a long road, and this road is being pelted with rain, and there are a sequence of streetlights lighting up in front of him occasionally to then transport him to a memory. Each memory is of him spending time with his friends, including Mari. Each time he sees one of these, it repairs a part of the violin slightly until finally he remembers the day that he got the violin as a gift, and he fearfully played the first note in front of his friends, not wanting to disappoint them. Then he finds himself backstage at the place where he would do his music recital. His friends are there, and they all give him their words of encouragement based on things they've told him before. All alone, he goes onto the stage and plays the sheet music alone, afterwards falling to his hands and knees and weeping. After he cries after playing his part of the sheet music, he then faces Omori in white space. As they're battling with each other, repeatedly as he keeps bringing Omori's health down to 0, it says Omori does not succumb. And eventually, Sunny is defeated by Omori. Then you're given the option of do you want to continue or not. If you press yes, then after that, Sunny gets up and he finishes Omori off with his part of the duet. And as the duet is playing, he's remembering his entire life with Mari back from his birth. As you're fighting Omori, he'll say, "You've caused so much suffering, yet you do nothing, and so you've earned nothing in return. Your friends will never forgive you. They'll abandon you like you did them, and that's what you deserve." He says, "You tell yourself that you don't want to burden others, but the truth is that you're selfish. You just don't want people to depend on you." He says, "When do you think about others? How long are you going to let people take care of you? You say you care, but you're a liar. You've never done anything for anyone else. You're useless. Less than useless. You're sick." He says, "People like you don't deserve to live." He says, "Your friends are wrong about you. The person they love isn't you at all. You let them believe in a lie to protect yourself." He says, "You're nothing but a liar, and when they see the truth, they'll hate you as much as you hate yourself." He says, "If they knew the truth, you'll never be able to regain their trust. No matter what you do, it'll be hopeless. All you'll do is make things worse. It would be better to just die." He says, "You killed Mari. She loved you and you killed her." And then after the fight is over, Sunny hugs Omori one last time before Omori fades away. So then Sunny wakes up in a hospital bed with a bandage over his eye, and he just starts sobbing to himself immediately. Then Sunny walks through the hallway, and as he's walking out of his hospital room and going to a junction in the hallway, he sees not his friends but his dream friends running up to him, and then they run off to play down another direction in the hall. You see a projection of Basil walking down in the other direction. So if you follow Basil, you can reach his hospital room. Sunny walks in, he sees all of his friends gathered around Basil. And the last thing that happens is he looks at his friends, and then the words appear, "I have to tell you something."
So I'm understanding correctly that very last moment is him actually willingly not fading into the facade that he held up for himself to have to avoid the truth, but instead actually telling them what happened. And he had to kill a part of himself to do it, and that was the part that slips into the temptation of not actually taking responsibility for something, and how hard that is. It's a wild ending. It's very interesting as an ending. That ending circles around a subject that I felt in my playthrough too, but I felt for a very different reason. And that is forgiveness. The nature of forgiveness, why we would forgive someone, and also why forgiveness is so often a moral imperative, and why it is so hard to persuade you to forgive at exactly the times when it's most necessary. There's different kinds of forgiveness that one can have. The kind of forgiveness that I thought this game was going to circle around, that the game was trying to deal with, was in relation to death. I thought this game was going to be about suicide. In my playthrough, it very much was putting me in the place of understanding why, for someone in the midst of that ideation, why it can be such a release for them, and why it makes sense, why it is reasonable for them to let go. And then part of making you have that experience is to help you understand the rational motivation behind it. And the only reason it's necessary to understand that is because the reason it's morally wrong to commit suicide is not because it may not be best for you under certain conditions. It's because you end up harming everyone else around you. You make their life miserable. You make it so that they suffer great psychic pain just like you did. And if you felt that your psychic pain was so bad that your life had to end, well then why would you impose that on someone else? But then this goes back to forgiveness, because often people get so angry at the person who decided to end their life. All they can think about is how selfish it is. Ironically, it's very selfish to view it that way. You're not actually empathizing with what it must have taken for them to be put in that space, to be put in that headspace. And so sometimes you do have to forgive because people are doing things that was rational based on their understanding, and maybe their understanding was greatly clouded. But then another kind of difficult forgiveness is to forgive yourself for having done something. And that's the forgiveness that it seems like this game is really about, and it's much more than just, okay, this person should have just moved past their grief about their sister. In this case, it's moving past their grief about what they thought of themselves. They learned something about themselves. Both of the main characters, Sunny and Basil, could not forgive themselves for the choice that they made. Even though they know exactly why they made that choice. They know that they were afraid of the punishment that they would receive. They were afraid of the lack of forgiveness of others being imposed on them, and so now they're being placed in a position where they can't forgive themselves. They're afraid of what it was saying about them to do this thing. And when they began to lie, they really, really believed that it was a means to a greater end, that if you just hide the truth, things will get better. And they would only do that if they thought really that it would get better. And of course, they were just wrong. They made a mistake. I guess the hard part about reflecting on something that you did in the past that you regret now is you learn something about yourself that maybe you don't like. The view is, well then I must be bad. You now have received an update to your self-concept of who you are. And that update isn't what you want to see. It's cruel, it's painful, what it is that you learn about yourself. There's this flip side to post-traumatic stress, which is post-traumatic growth. You go through a trauma, except you put a different frame around what that trauma is. The trauma is exactly the same. What you learn in that trauma is exactly the same. And so much of what makes trauma devastating is what you learn. If you see someone pass away, you just gained information about what it is to actually go through that pain. That's a kind of learning. When you make a huge mistake, you're learning something. And someone who has difficulty dealing with that trauma has turned that information into a negative very strongly. I want to go back to what I was. I don't want to have this new information. The person who feels post-traumatic growth sees it as an opportunity. They are learning a new self-concept. They are learning something that was always true about themselves, which is that put in this situation, this is who you always were, you just believed otherwise. And something that is always true about everyone, which is that so many other people would have done exactly the same. And now that you've actually experienced it, you've actually gained an understanding of something. By gaining that understanding, you are finally reaching a point of having enough information in front of you to actually be able to make a choice. Prior to that point, you didn't really make a choice. You were reacting reflexively to the feeling of panic in that moment. You're just doing what you felt like doing because you weren't prepared for it. Now that you have that experience, if you choose to see it as such, it is now finally information for you to actually make a choice about the kind of life that you want to have. This kid Sunny made a huge mistake, and Basil made a huge mistake. They did this thing, and of course, it made sense at the time, but as they grew from this, and of course they're growing from it, it becomes more painful because now they're really facing again the additional choice of what are you going to do with that information. So much of the spiraling nature of it is they're not allowing themselves to actually make the choice. And that choice is to say, okay, I need to accept this about myself. It's true whether I like it or not. I can't just hide it forever. And if I accept that it's true, I actually gained something by that fact. I didn't lose something because I learned something about myself. That is something valuable if you choose to understand it as such. Thomas Nagel makes a point about moral luck, which is that blame implies control. If you're going to blame someone for something, it presumes that they had a choice to do otherwise. But so much of the harm done by someone's actions was based on things that are outside of their control, limited information and/or merely their emotional state. If someone is such that they're extremely sensitive to the point that maybe they cry very quickly or they just get really angry, and let's say that they lash out at a friend and then that friend kills themselves later that day, they will blame themselves because they knew that they were one part of that series of steps. You are sensitive in such a way that through a cascade of experiences, you ended up putting your emotional state in such a position that the relief that you got from that emotional state only came from doing things like that. and it never killed anyone before. So of course, why would you think that it would lead to that kind of a consequence? It's mere luck. The actions that Sunny was doing reasonably wouldn't have led to his sister dying, her falling down the stairs and hurting herself. He was throwing a tantrum. He was having a hard time dealing with her scolding. He didn't try to kill her. It would really only be blameworthy if he actually did things that reasonably would lead to that outcome. And then after the fact, when he makes the decision to hide it, there's a reason behind that, and that is because the consequences are not going to bring her back to life. The consequences are only going to make his life even worse. It's already something really, really bad, and it's about to get substantially worse, and he thought this is the way to fix it. And he was of course wrong, but he didn't know. If he knew, he probably would have done something else. Socrates makes that point about virtue. You think the non-virtuous person is purposefully doing something to make their life worse? They think the bad action is the right thing for them. And it's only through a fuller view of the world that you get to see the ways in which it leads to a worse outcome. But of course, had they had that view, then they would have done that. But from their point of view, that was the best thing that they could have done. And it's so easy to blame from the outside. We have this temptation to punish and to impose a sanction on someone for having done something. And a lot of that is very naturally from this position of, well, this is a deterrent for a future effect. But if your impulse is to punish and to hate is not actually deterring anything, then you really are just increasing the pain in the world. You are just doing harm on someone. You're not actually doing anything good. It only feels good because the sanction is good. But the degree of effect on the world is you are just increasing the level of suffering, unless it's having some actual alternative effect. The value of reminding yourself how little choice you actually had is a way of reminding yourself that the person you were when you made that choice that you now regret was a person who didn't have the information you now have, which is the information that comes from having made that regretful choice. And now that you're in that position, you are now a version of yourself with that information. And that is a valuable opportunity to be something better, to be exactly what you wanted to be and actually make a real choice on the basis of that information. And to impose judgment on your past self for information that past self didn't have is to slip into a kind of delusion, a kind of hasty generalization, not about self versus others, but a single self over a lifetime. That one self that is you is the same from beginning to end, when the fact of the matter is the you that you were 10 years ago is essentially a different person from the you that exists now. The you that was there when you made that horrible mistake is essentially different than the you now that is regretting that mistake. And that is a chance for you to build off of that. It does require a very distant view of this moral chain that we're locked into.
One of the delicate and brilliant touches in the way that this story unfolds is that, to me, it presents an unlucky and unfortunate accident with the full context of what that means, not just in terms of how unlucky someone can be, but what your choices mean in response to that. At the risk of going too deep into another subject, I think I need to spell out something that I hold dear about the concept of determinism. To me, determinism is often framed in a way that I feel is incomplete. The idea of determinism is that our actions are not wholly determined by our choices, that ultimately the events of our lives are not fully in our control, that we don't have free will that can simply steer us into the exact expectations that we always wanted. We talked about this before when we talk about adapting to the ways that life will shunt us in an unexpected direction, and we can either adapt to it or not. And so one way that, in my opinion, is false of looking at determinism is to view it as this catastrophic loss of control. If we don't have full control of our surroundings, then that is tantamount to no control. That now we are in the same predicament that we were in when we thought we had full control. When we thought we had full control, free will, we thought that everything was our fault. When we start to think that actually the world is deterministic and everything is determined by external factors, we think everything's not my fault, but now nothing is under my control, which is not better news. The more casually intuitive, helpful way of thinking about determinism is to remember that all determinism really tells you is that not everything's your fault. It tells you that sometimes when something horrible happens to you that seems like it's your fault, you cannot put all of the blame on yourself. That is good news. That actually is a more realistic way of looking at your place in the world. You are not a superhero because you don't have full control over everything, and you are not a supervillain because you could not possibly be the only reason that there is so much suffering in your life. So this moment when Sunny accidentally pushes Mari down the stairs and then intentionally lies about it, it is the meeting point of what we have to deal with as human beings. We have to deal with things that are out of our control, and then we have to deal with the realization that we do affect what happens next. Then that makes us feel ashamed of the ways that we did mess up. Because of course, Sunny acted hastily, and he made a decision that was ultimately going to lead to years of suffering on his part and those of his friends. Which of course was not his goal, but that is the result of his actions. It seems like an update about his character. It seems like now he knows, oh, I'm sure some of it was an accident, but I'm the real source of the horror here. This is where determinism helps the most of all to me, because there are more ways to do things wrong than there are to do things right. So when you aim for a target and you do not hit it, I would hope that most people, when they experience that literal scenario where they miss a target, you would not assume that that means you wanted to. You would not assume that that means, oh, my character is to miss the target. But for some reason, when it comes to morals, we think that when we do something wrong, that means that we wanted people to suffer. But that's not a fair assumption. That is a narrative that has been perpetuated for a very long time by many cultures in many different ways, but it's not actually an inevitable way of thinking about the moral impact of your actions. The more simple and straightforward way of looking at wrongdoing is to see it like missing a target. It is wrong, but you're not wrong. Those can both be true. It's not about trying to defend it, and there's no need to defend yourself, because doing wrong does not guarantee that you're a bad person. I just know, speaking for myself, there was a period in my life when I was at my most nihilistic. I not only felt like life was pointless, but I felt like it was pointless for someone to exist who thinks that life is pointless. That in itself is some sort of crime. Like, the only thing more pointless than this world was me, because I saw it that way. I definitely had a while there where I saw myself as something worthless and something monstrous, but the fact that I was being so judgmental to myself meant that I couldn't talk to anybody about it. There was nothing to say, because it's like I'm just admitting to a crime. Thankfully, I also know what it's like to have the time and the luck of the draw to have had the right thoughts to bring myself out of that. I see things very differently from how I did before. In my mind, I'm glad that I don't do it out of desperation. I haven't chosen to be less nihilistic as a coping mechanism. I haven't chosen to be less nihilistic in such a way that it makes me feel better. I never got happier as a result of becoming less nihilistic. I chose that because I thought it made sense, because I really think that there's something just plainly illogical about labeling yourself as a monster and labeling life as pointless. And part of that realization came from noticing that that's just not how anyone consistently thinks. I think back to the fact that we all have things in our life that we're perfectly willing to take feedback on, even negative feedback. If you have a skill for math, you turn in a math problem to your teacher, they put a red mark on one of the answers. I think most people, hopefully, don't view that red mark as a judgment. See it as a red mark that applies to the answer, not to the person who provided the answer. We can think about everything like that. I don't actually have to always assume that I am sullied by the inaccuracy of my aim, that I am somehow made worse by the fact that I am capable of mistakes. And I still get to have the benefit of feedback if I remember that. I still get to remember when someone tells me I'm doing wrong, it's not because they think I'm a monster. Not only do I not have to think of myself as a monster, maybe other people aren't thinking of me as a monster either. Maybe when someone tells me I'm wrong, it's because they think I can get better. Maybe it's because they think I have it in me to get better. Isn't it a compliment when someone tells me that I was wrong? Not in the sense that my being was wrong, but my actions were. And I just realized I wasn't being logically consistent by thinking of myself or anybody as a monster. That I was perfectly capable of just taking it on the chin and just realizing, like, yeah, the realization that you're imperfect is not actually that distressing if you don't let it be. You can choose to see the fear as just another one of the many unnecessary fears that we blow out of proportion in our life. We're afraid of judgments that aren't necessarily there. And they probably came from something. It's like all trauma. Somebody probably does judge you. There are people in your life who absolutely are going to be extremely judgmental. If you were ever judgmental to yourself, then you already have proof of that. But that doesn't mean that your fear of judgment is necessarily accurate. You're fearing something that is not always there. But the important question to ask is, even if I'm afraid of it, do I actually see it? Is it actually there? Is there anything to be afraid of? That's the kind of thing that is so beautiful about this ending that shows a little boy making a mistake and then facing his friends in a way that does not immediately make things less complicated. As soon as he tells his friends what happened, that's probably going to be a difficult conversation. They're probably not going to forgive him right away. But the game doesn't focus on that because that would put too much of a spotlight on this fear that we have, oh, things are going to be too complicated if I tell the truth. Well, they are going to be complicated, but you're going to have people with you through that complication. And that is better than being alone.